For over 2 millennia, one name has echoed through the corridors of history, synonymous with power, allure, and tragedy: Cleopatra. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a queen who dared to challenge the might of Rome, a woman whose intellect and ambition shaped the destiny of empires. Her image, immortalized in art, literature, and film, remains an iconic, if often misunderstood, symbol. But who was the real Cleopatra, the woman behind the myth? She seduced an empire, or so they wanted you to believe. Queen, strategist, survivor. Rome called her a temptress. History made her a legend. But what if everything you know about her is a lie? Powerful men feared her. One declared war just to erase her name. Join us as we journey back in time to the glittering courts of Alexandria and the treacherous battlefields of the Roman Republic to unravel the complex life and enduring legacy of the Queen of the Nile. Welcome to Legendary Lives. If you're closing your eyes for the night or leaning in close for a story well told, you're in the right place. If you like what we do here, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're listening from. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Our story begins not amidst the timeless, sun-scorched sands of an ancient, monolithic Egypt, but in a city that pulsed with a vibrant, almost frenetic energy. A city that was the undisputed jewel of the Mediterranean, the beating heart of the Hellenistic world, Alexandria. Imagine, if you will, a metropolis born from the audacious dream of Alexander the Great himself, a young conqueror who, in 331 BC, stood on a narrow strip of land between the sea and a vast lagoon and envisioned a capital that would bear his name and bridge continents. And what a city it became! Alexandria was no dusty provincial outpost. It was a crucible of cultures, a dazzling beacon of learning, and the pivotal hub of commerce that ferried the silks of the East to the markets of the West and the philosophies of Greece to the scholars of Egypt. Its famed museion, a term that gives us our modern word museum, was less a collection of relics and more a vibrant research institute, a proto-university that drew the brightest minds from across the known world. Attached to it, or perhaps an integral part of it, was the Great Library of Alexandria, a legendary repository of knowledge, said to house hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls containing the wisdom of civilizations. Here, luminaries like Euclid formulated geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, and Heron devised ingenious steam-powered contraptions. The air itself seemed to crackle with intellectual ferment, a place where, as the historian Strabo, a near contemporary, described, scholars receive salaries and share common property and a common refectory. It was a state-sponsored think tank on an unprecedented scale. Picture wide colonnaded streets laid out on a grid system, bustling with activity. Grand temples, like the magnificent Serapeium, dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, towered over the city, their white marble gleaming in the African sun. Lush public gardens offered respite from the urban clamour, and the great harbour, dominated by the colossal Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, teemed with ships bearing goods and people from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. Within this cosmopolitan marvel, a kaleidoscope of populations coexisted, though not always harmoniously. Greeks, the ruling elite, mingled with native Egyptians, a substantial Jewish community thrived, and merchants and mercenaries from Syria, Anatolia, Italy, and countless other lands added to the city's rich and sometimes volatile human tapestry.
Though often living in legally segregated quarters, their lives and destinies were inextricably intertwined. Alexandria was, in essence, the New York or London of its day, a global city, a melting pot of innovation, ambition, and intrigue. It was into this dazzling, yet inherently dangerous world that Cleopatra VII was born, most likely in the early weeks of 69 BC. She was a daughter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Macedonian Greek rulers who had governed Egypt for nearly 2.5 centuries, ever since the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. The dynasty's founder, Ptolemy I Soter, meaning the savior, was one of Alexander's most trusted generals, a shrewd and capable soldier who, in the chaotic aftermath of Alexander's sudden demise, carved out Egypt as his personal kingdom. He and his successors, all named Ptolemy, established a uniquely hybrid state, Greek in its administration and culture at the top, yet ruling over an ancient Egyptian civilization with millennia of tradition. The Ptolemies, in their determination to maintain power and preserve what they considered the purity of their Macedonian bloodline, frequently engaged in a practice that seems shocking to modern sensibilities, though it aligned with ancient Egyptian pharaonic traditions: sibling marriage. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, all in an effort to keep the royal power and the vast wealth of Egypt within the immediate family. While this may have consolidated power in the short term, it also bred a dynasty rife with intense internal rivalries, conspiracies, and assassinations. Cleopatra's own court, as historian Plutarch would later allude to in his writings on Antony, was no stranger to this dark legacy. It was a place, as one modern scholar describes it, beset by violence, murder, and corruption. The palace was a gilded cage where whispers in shadowy colonnades could be as deadly as a drawn sword. This was the inheritance of any Ptolemaic princess. Immense privilege, yes, but also constant peril. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, a king whose reign was as precarious as it was controversial. He was known by the rather derisive nickname Aulates, meaning the flute player. This wasn't a compliment. It was a sneer from his detractors, suggesting he was more dedicated to his musical dabblings and revelries. He also styled himself Neos Dionysus, the new Dionysus, than to the serious business of statecraft. And serious business it was, for Ptolemy Aulates' grip on power was tenuous at best. He had ascended the throne amidst political turmoil and the ever-expanding shadow of Roman interference. Egypt, though still nominally independent, was by this time virtually a client kingdom of the burgeoning Roman Republic, a Mediterranean superpower whose legions and political machinations were reshaping the world. Aulates' reign was largely defined by his desperate and ruinously expensive attempts to secure Rome's favor and official recognition. He paid enormous bribes to powerful Roman figures, men like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, to ensure they would prop up his shaky throne. One such bribe, to have himself officially declared friend and ally of the Roman people, cost him a staggering 6,000 talents of silver, an amount that could have funded an army. This policy drained Egypt's treasury, debased its currency, and fueled widespread discontent among his people, who bore the brunt of the increased taxation. As the contemporary historian Diodorus Siculus noted, the Egyptian people were greatly alienated from him on account of his intemperate life and his exaction of money. This unpopularity, coupled with Rome's typically rapacious annexation of Cyprus in 58 BC, an island then ruled by Aulates' own brother, ignited a popular revolt in Alexandria. The citizens, fed up with his misrule and subservience to Rome, drove Aulates from his throne and into exile. He fled, quite naturally, to Rome, the very power he had so assiduously courted, to plead for his restoration. During his 3-year absence, his formidable older daughter, Berenice IV, Cleopatra's half-sister, seized the throne and ruled in her own right, even marrying a couple of pretenders to solidify her claim. Auletes eventually clawed his way back to power in 55 BC, but only with the backing of Roman legions, supplied by the Roman governor of Syria, Aulus Gabinius, and, of course, more eye-watering payments. His restoration was a bloody affair. One of his first acts was to execute Berenice, his own daughter. A stark lesson for any surviving children. Power in Ptolemaic Egypt was a brutal zero-sum game. The price of Auletes' return was not just blood, but also a further deepening of Egypt's subservience to Rome, and a crushing debt that would burden the kingdom for years to come. The identity of Cleopatra's mother remains a tantalizing uncertainty, a whisper in the historical record. She was likely Cleopatra V Tryphena, who was Ptolemy XII's sister and wife, a typical Ptolemaic arrangement. Some scholars suggest there might have been another wife, perhaps a Cleopatra VI, or that Cleopatra V Tryphena died and Auletes remarried. It's even possible Cleopatra's mother was a woman of a prominent priestly family from Memphis, which would make Cleopatra part Egyptian by blood, though this is less widely accepted. The official silence on her maternal lineage in many records is curious. Regardless of the specifics, young Cleopatra was raised within the opulent but perilous confines of the Alexandrian palace, a silent, observant witness to the brutal power plays, the whispers of conspiracy that slithered through the corridors, and the ever-looming, often humiliating, shadow of Roman dominance.
These formative experiences, the constant political maneuvering, the violent dynastic feuds that saw family members turn on each other with chilling regularity, and her father's degrading dependence on a foreign power, would profoundly shape her understanding of rule. She would have seen firsthand the consequences of weakness, the necessity of ruthlessness, and the complex, dangerous dance of diplomacy with Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty's increasing reliance on Roman patronage, so starkly demonstrated by Auletes, was not merely a sign of astute foreign policy, as some might have argued. It was a glaring symptom of its own internal decay and eroding legitimacy in the eyes of its diverse subjects. This precarious inheritance, a kingdom unimaginably rich in history and resources, yet teetering on the brink of political and economic collapse, its sovereignty mortgaged to a foreign power, set the stage for Cleopatra's own extraordinary and ultimately tragic reign. She would learn from her father's struggles, recognizing both the seductive necessity of Roman alliances and the inherent, potentially fatal, dangers of such dependencies. She would learn that to survive, let alone thrive, she would need to be more cunning, more resilient, and perhaps more ruthless than any Ptolemy before her. And Alexandria itself, this glittering, multicultural jewel of the Mediterranean, was more than just a backdrop to these dynastic struggles. It was an active ingredient in the forging of its future queen. The city breathed intellectualism and cosmopolitanism. Its famed library and museum were not just grand buildings, but vibrant, living centers of scholarship, attracting the finest minds from across the Hellenistic world. This unique environment, a melting pot of Greek philosophy, Egyptian tradition, Jewish scholarship, and countless other cultural currents, offered unparalleled exposure to diverse ideas, languages, and worldviews. It was in this crucible of learning and cultural exchange that the young princess began her education, an education that would arm her with tools far more potent than any ceremonial dagger. This rich, multicultural milieu, the sheer intellectual horsepower concentrated within a few square miles of her palace, would foster in Cleopatra an adaptability, a quickness of mind, and a linguistic prowess that would distinguish her sharply from her more insular, often monolingual predecessors.
It was an education that would equip her, in ways she could not yet imagine, to navigate the complex, treacherous world stage upon which she was destined to play a leading and legendary role. The serpent was coiled, absorbing the lessons of her perilous court, preparing for the moment she would strike. In the heart of Alexandria's royal quarter, the Brucheion, adjacent to the sprawling palace complex that glittered with gold and echoed with the murmur of courtly intrigue, stood the Mouseion and the Great Library, twin sanctuaries of knowledge that were the envy of the ancient world. It was here, amidst the hushed rustle of papyrus scrolls holding the accumulated wisdom of ages, and in the company of some of the most renowned scholars and thinkers of the era, that the formidable intellect of the young Princess Cleopatra was meticulously honed. Like other Ptolemaic royalty, she received a comprehensive Hellenistic education, a rigorous intellectual grounding designed not merely for cultural refinement, but as an essential preparation for the labyrinthine complexities of rule in a kingdom that was both a Hellenistic power and an ancient African civilization. Her formal education would have been steeped in the Greek paideia, a curriculum that emphasized philosophy, rhetoric, literature, mathematics, and music. Tutors were carefully selected, often from the ranks of the Mouseion's own scholars. While specific names are scarce, it's highly probable that figures like Philostratus, a respected philosopher and orator known to have been in Alexandria during this period, guided her studies in the Greek arts of persuasive speech and logical reasoning, skills absolutely crucial for any leader wishing to command respect, negotiate treaties, and sway assemblies. She would have delved into the canonical texts of Greek literature, the epic poems of Homer, the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, and the philosophical dialogues of Plato and Aristotle. These were not mere academic exercises, they were explorations of human nature, political theory, and the very foundations of Hellenistic thought. Beyond the humanities, her education likely encompassed the sciences. The Ptolemaic court had a long tradition of patronizing scientific inquiry. She would have been exposed to mathematics, perhaps studying Euclid's Elements, which had been compiled in Alexandria itself. Astronomy, a science deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious beliefs and calendrical systems, would also have been part of her curriculum. There's a persistent, though debated, tradition that Cleopatra herself possessed considerable medical knowledge, possibly even authoring treatises on medicine, cosmetics, and pharmacology. While direct authorship is difficult to prove, her interest in such subjects is plausible given Alexandria's status as a center for medical learning and the practical value of such knowledge for a ruler concerned with the well-being of her people and indeed her own. Physicians like Olympos, who served at her father's court and whose writings were later consulted by Plutarch for his life of Antony, would have been among the many learned individuals with whom she interacted, absorbing their knowledge and insights.
Perhaps Cleopatra's most remarkable intellectual gift, and one that would prove to be an invaluable asset throughout her reign, was her extraordinary aptitude for languages. Ancient sources, most notably the Greek biographer Plutarch, writing about a century after her death, but drawing on earlier accounts, attest to Cleopatra's exceptional linguistic abilities. He marvels that she rarely needed an interpreter, even when dealing with envoys from a multitude of nations. She was said to speak as many as 9 languages. Her native tongue was, of course, Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Hellenistic East and the language of her Macedonian ancestors and the Ptolemaic court. But crucially, and in stark contrast to her predecessors, Cleopatra made the effort to learn Egyptian. This was a profound political statement. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt as a Greek elite, often remaining aloof from the culture and language of their native subjects. Cleopatra's decision to master Egyptian allowed her to connect directly with the majority of her population, to understand their concerns,
and to present herself not merely as a foreign overlord, but as a legitimate pharaoh in the ancient tradition. Plutarch further lists an impressive array of other languages in her repertoire. Ethiopian, likely Meroitic, from the kingdom of Kush to the south, the language of the troglodytes, peoples inhabiting the desert regions along the Red Sea coast, Hebrew, Arabic, likely Nabatean Arabic, spoken by the influential trading kingdom centered on Petra, Syriac, Aramaic, widely spoken in the Levant, Median, and Parthian, the language of Rome's great eastern rival. Plutarch describes her tongue as an instrument of many strings which she could turn to any language that she pleased. While some modern scholars have viewed this linguistic prowess as a mere hobby, a natural outcome of Alexandria's cosmopolitan environment, or perhaps an exaggeration by later writers, a more compelling interpretation, advanced by scholars like Dwayne W. Roller, suggests a deeply strategic purpose. Cleopatra's multilingualism was likely a form of imperial rhetoric, a deliberate and carefully cultivated tool to project power, facilitate diplomacy, and connect with the diverse peoples within the Ptolemaic sphere of influence and its aspired territories. The languages listed by Plutarch, stretching from Nubia and the Horn of Africa through the Levant and Arabia to the Iranian plateau, remarkably mirror the historical extent and future ambitions of both the Ptolemaic and the earlier Seleucid empires. By addressing envoys in their native tongues, likely in carefully orchestrated public audiences, Cleopatra was not just simplifying communication, she was performing her role as a ruler with a claim to a vast, multicultural dominion, following ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal representation, where linguistic mastery was a sign of universal sovereignty.
Her education, however, was not confined to the rarefied atmosphere of the Mauseon or the tutelage of scholars. The most profound, and perhaps most brutal, lessons in the realities of power came from observing the tumultuous and often humiliating reign of her own father, Ptolemy XII Auletes. She witnessed firsthand the chronic instability of the Ptolemaic throne, the crushing weight of Roman interference, and the dire consequences of financial mismanagement, popular discontent, and internal dynastic strife. Auletes' reign was a constant, desperate struggle for survival, marked by his sycophantic pursuit of Roman favor, the crippling debt incurred through massive bribes to figures like Caesar and Pompey, and the internal revolts that led to his temporary ousting by the Alexandrian mob and the brief rule of his daughter Berenice IV. The violent restoration of Auletes in 55 BC, achieved only with the backing of Roman legions under Aulus Gabinius, and followed by the swift execution of his own rebellious daughter Berenice, would have been a stark and unforgettable lesson for the young Cleopatra, then around 14 years old. It demonstrated with chilling clarity the ruthlessness required to seize and hold power in the Ptolemaic court, where family ties were often secondary to political expediency. She saw how her father, despite his efforts to appease Rome, was often treated with contempt, his kingdom viewed as a resource to be exploited. This must have instilled in her a deep understanding of the complex and dangerous game of Roman politics, the necessity of securing powerful Roman patrons, but also the inherent risks of becoming overly dependent on them. These formative experiences, the constant political maneuvering, the ever-present threat of assassination, the violent dynastic feuds that saw family members turn on each other with chilling regularity, and her father's degrading dependence on a foreign power, would profoundly shape her understanding of rule. She learned the critical importance of a strong treasury, the dangers of alienating her own populace, and the delicate balance required in dealing with the Colossus of Rome.
The instability of her father's rule, the constant threat of Roman annexation, and the deadly intrigues of the Alexandrian court forged in her a steely resolve, a pragmatic cynicism, and a sophisticated political mind.
Her education, therefore, was a dual curriculum, one of formal Hellenistic learning that sharpened her intellect and provided her with the cultural tools of her Greek heritage, and another, far harsher, education in the practicalities of Ptolemaic kingship, learned in the perilous corridors of the palace and from the failures and desperate measures of her father. It was this unique combination, the refined intellect of a scholar and the hardened pragmatism of a survivor, that would define her reign. The Ptolemaic dynasty's long-standing tension between its Hellenistic ruling culture and the ancient Egyptian civilization it governed found a unique potential synthesis in Cleopatra. Unlike many of her forebears, who often remained culturally Greek and aloof from their Egyptian subjects, Cleopatra's decision to learn the Egyptian language and, later in her reign, to embrace Egyptian religious iconography, particularly her powerful association with the goddess Isis, was a masterstroke of political strategy. It was a deliberate effort to bridge the cultural divide, to legitimize her rule in the eyes of the native population, and to harness the deep spiritual power of pharaonic tradition. This was a level of cultural integration and political astuteness that her predecessors had largely neglected, often to their detriment. She was not just learning to be a Ptolemaic queen, she was learning how to be the queen Egypt needed to survive in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. The year is 51 BC. The flamboyant, controversial, and often beleaguered reign of Ptolemy XII Auletes, the flute player, finally drew to a close. Perhaps he played one last tune for the ferryman Charon. In his will, a document lodged with all due solemnity in Rome for safekeeping, a testament to Egypt's de facto vassalage, Auletes bequeathed his kingdom, the richest jewel of the Hellenistic East, to his two eldest surviving children. On one side of this uneasy equation stood Cleopatra, now a young woman of 18, her mind sharpened by an exceptional education and the harsh lessons of her father's precarious rule. On the other, her considerably younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a mere boy of 10, still more suited to the schoolroom than the throne room. As was the deeply ingrained, if often disastrous, custom of the Ptolemaic dynasty, they were to rule jointly, and it was widely expected, though concrete evidence remains elusive, that they would marry. Brother-sister, husband-wife, co-monarchs, a recipe for domestic bliss, or more likely, dynastic implosion. Cleopatra, however, ascended to a throne that was anything but stable. Egypt, the ancient breadbasket of the Mediterranean, was groaning under a multitude of burdens. The treasury, plundered by Auletes to pay off his Roman patrons, was severely depleted. The currency had been debased, its silver content shamefully low, leading to rampant inflation that squeezed the common people. To compound these woes, the lifeblood of Egypt, the sacred Nile, had failed to deliver its customary life-giving flood for several consecutive years. The result was catastrophic: parched fields, withered crops, and a devastating famine that stalked the land, from the bustling streets of Alexandria to the remote villages of Upper Egypt. Such widespread suffering inevitably bred social unrest. A simmering nationalist sentiment, a deep-seated resentment among the native Egyptian population against centuries of Greek rule and economic exploitation, threatened to boil over. This was the kingdom Cleopatra inherited, a magnificent, ancient land teetering on the precipice of economic collapse and internal rebellion. A poisoned chalice, if ever there was one. From the very moment she donned the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, Cleopatra demonstrated an unshakable resolve to be more than just a ceremonial queen, more than a mere placeholder for her boy brother.
She was not about to be the pretty face on the coinage while others pulled the strings. Official documents from the earliest months of her reign, papyri dated as early as August 29, 51 BC, bear witness to her ambition. Her name, Cleopatra, appears alone, or pointedly, before that of her brother Ptolemy. A subtle shift in protocol, perhaps, but a clear and defiant statement of intent. She was the senior ruler, the dominant partner in this royal charade. She was, in the words of one historian, determined to rule as a king.
Ancient sources, though often filtered through a Roman lens, paint a picture of a young queen who was remarkably hands-on. She wasn't content to delegate and drift in the perfumed air of the palace. She reportedly made herself accessible, personally listening to the grievances of her subjects, a practice that would have been both time-consuming and politically astute. She acted as the chief judge in legal disputes, a role traditionally held by pharaohs, and she wasn't afraid to bring the hammer down on corrupt officials who preyed on the populace. She understood, with a pragmatism that belied her years, that Egypt's wealth, and therefore its power, flowed from the fertile black earth of the Nile Valley. She took a keen interest in agriculture, supervising the critical cycles of sowing and harvesting, and ensuring the efficient management of state monopolies like papyrus production, the ancient world's equivalent of the information superhighway. One of her first significant public acts, in March of 51 BC, was a journey south to Hermonthis near Thebes, the ancient religious capital. There, with all due pomp and ceremony, she participated in the sacred ritual of installing a new Butchis bull, a living manifestation of the warrior god Montu. This was no mere photo opportunity. For a Greek queen to so publicly embrace and participate in such a deeply traditional Egyptian religious rite was a powerful signal. It demonstrated her respect for the ancient beliefs of her native subjects, a crucial step in legitimizing her rule in their eyes and differentiating herself from many of her more aloof Ptolemaic predecessors who often seemed to view Egypt as little more than a personal cash cow. Faced with the crippling economic crisis, Cleopatra implemented bold and perhaps risky reforms. She took the decisive step of further devaluing the already debased Egyptian currency, reducing its silver content by a third. This was likely a calculated gamble, aimed at making Egyptian exports, particularly grain, more competitive on the international market, thereby stimulating trade and bringing much-needed foreign currency into the depleted treasury. There's even a persistent, though unproven, ancient tradition, mentioned by the scholar Julius that she authored learned treatises on coinage, weights, and measures, a rather dry subject for a teenage queen, perhaps, but indicative of a sharp mind focused on the practical levers of state power. She also initiated social and land reforms, though the specifics are frustratingly scarce in the historical record. These were likely aimed at alleviating the crushing poverty that fueled so much of the popular discontent and addressing the grievances of the small farmers who formed the backbone of the Egyptian economy. During the severe famine that gripped Egypt in the early years of her reign, Cleopatra acted with a decisiveness that shamed many more experienced rulers. She ordered the royal granaries, traditionally hoarded by the crown, to be opened, distributing precious grain to the starving populace. She also took measures to curtail the predatory practices of tax collectors, who, like vultures, often swooped in to pick clean the already destitute farmers. These early administrative actions paint a picture of a ruler with considerable foresight, a sophisticated understanding of economic and social dynamics, and a genuine concern, or at least a politically astute display of concern, for the welfare of her people. She was actively working to build a base of popular support, a power base independent of the entrenched and often treacherous palace old guard.
However, Cleopatra's very competence, her assertiveness, and her independent style of rule quickly brought her into direct collision with the powerful and deeply entrenched figures who traditionally manipulated the Ptolemaic throne. Her young brother, Ptolemy XIII, was little more than a puppet, his strings firmly held by a triumvirate of ambitious and ruthless advisers. There was Pothinus, a eunuch of considerable influence, who served as regent and chief minister, effectively controlling the kingdom's finances and administration. There was Achilles, the formidable commander of the Egyptian army, a man who held the ultimate loyalty of the soldiers. And then there was Theodotus of Chios, a rhetorician and the young king's tutor, who provided the intellectual justification for their power grabs. This trio found the boy king, Ptolemy XIII, far more pliable, far more amenable to their whispers and machinations than his intelligent, headstrong, energetic older sister. They were accustomed to wielding power from behind the throne, and Cleopatra's blatant refusal to be their marionette was a direct and intolerable threat to their established influence and their personal ambitions. An incident involving Roman mercenaries likely brought the simmering tensions to a boil. Some Roman soldiers, part of the Gabiniani troops left in Egypt by Aulus Gabinius to prop up Auletus's throne, had murdered the sons of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, the Roman governor of Syria, who were visiting Egypt. Cleopatra, in a move that demonstrated her commitment to maintaining good relations with Rome, or perhaps her fear of Roman retribution, had the culprits arrested and handed them over to Bibulus for justice. This independent exercise of authority, bypassing her brother's counselors, infuriated Pothinus and his clique. It was a clear sign that Cleopatra would not be controlled.
The power struggle, once confined to whispered conspiracies in shadowy palace corridors, now erupted into open conflict. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus began to actively maneuver against the queen. They rallied the support of the army, playing on the soldiers' loyalty to Achilles and perhaps their suspicion of a queen who seemed too independent, too clever by half. They also stirred up elements of the notoriously volatile Alexandrian mob, always ready for a riot if the price or the provocation was right. By 49 or early 48 BC, Cleopatra found herself outmaneuvered, isolated, and facing a direct and credible threat to her life. The gilded cage of the Ptolemaic court had snapped shut. Forced to flee the capital, she initially sought refuge in the Thebaid region of Upper Egypt, an area with strong native Egyptian traditions where her gestures of religious piety might have earned her some support. But the forces arrayed against her were too powerful. Eventually, she made her way to Roman Syria, a land familiar with Ptolemaic exiles and intrigues. But Cleopatra was no ordinary refugee. She was not about to fade quietly into obscurity. With characteristic grit and resourcefulness, she began to gather an army of mercenaries, Arab tribesmen, and Syrian warriors, determined to fight her way back to her throne and reclaim her birthright. The serpent, temporarily driven from her nest, was coiling, ready to strike back. As if the political situation wasn't already a tangled mess of vipers, Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, also decided to throw her diadem into the ring. Sensing opportunity in the chaos, Arsinoe emerged as yet another rival claimant to the throne, further complicating the already treacherous political landscape and adding another layer to the impending family feud that was about to become a full-blown civil war. The stage was now set, not just for an internal Egyptian power struggle, but for a conflict that would soon draw in the most powerful man in the Roman world, a man whose arrival would irrevocably alter the fate of Egypt and of Cleopatra herself.
while Cleopatra, with the tenacity of a desert viper, was marshalling her mercenary forces on the dusty eastern frontiers of Egypt, the colossal gears of Roman power politics were grinding inexorably towards a dramatic and bloody climax on Egyptian soil. The Roman Republic, that sprawling, insatiable giant of the Mediterranean, was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. Two of its most formidable sons, once allies, now bitter rivals, stood at the heart of the conflagration. Gaius Julius Caesar, the brilliant, ambitious conqueror of Gaul, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, a celebrated general who had long been Rome's most powerful man. Their struggle was not just a clash of personal ambitions, it was a battle for the very soul and future of Rome. In August of 48 BC, on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece, the decisive moment arrived. Caesar, outnumbered but tactically superior, delivered a crushing defeat to Pompey's legions. The battle was a bloodbath, shattering Pompey's forces and his aura of invincibility. Pompey the Great, the man who had once boasted that he had only to stamp his foot for legions to spring from the earth, was now a fugitive. He fled the battlefield, his grand ambitions in ruins, desperately seeking sanctuary. His gaze turned eastward, towards Egypt. It was a kingdom where he had previously wielded considerable influence, having played a key role in the restoration of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Auleus, to his throne. Egypt, he perhaps reasoned, owed him a debt of gratitude, a safe harbor in the storm of his defeat. It was a fatal miscalculation. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the court of the boy king Ptolemy XIII was abuzz with news of Caesar's victory and Pompey's desperate flight. The king's powerful advisers, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the tutor Theodotus of Chios, faced a critical decision. Should they offer refuge to their erstwhile Roman patron, Pompey, an act that would surely incur the wrath of the victorious Caesar? Or should they attempt to curry favor with the new master of Rome? Their choice, when it came, was as ruthless as it was short-sighted. As Pompey's ship anchored off Pelusium, the eastern gateway to Egypt, on September 28, 48 BC, he was met not with a welcoming party, but with a death squad. Lured into a small boat on the pretext of being taken ashore, the 60-year-old Roman statesman was treacherously stabbed to death, his head severed, his body unceremoniously dumped in the shallows. Theodotus, with a chilling piece of sophistry, is said to have remarked, "A dead man does not bite." They believed this gruesome offering, Pompey's pickled head and his signet ring, would be a welcome gift to Caesar, a clear demonstration of their loyalty. They could not have been more wrong. Their act of brutal expediency displayed a profound misunderstanding of Roman sensibilities, even those concerning a defeated enemy, and it inadvertently handed Caesar the perfect pretext to intervene directly in Egyptian affairs. A few days later, Julius Caesar, having pursued his rival across the Mediterranean with characteristic speed, arrived in Alexandria with a small fleet and a modest force of around 4,000 legionaries. When Pothinus and his cohorts presented him with Pompey's severed head, Caesar, according to the Roman historian Plutarch, turned away from him with loathing as from an assassin, and when he received Pompey's signet ring, he burst into tears. Whether these tears were genuine grief for a former son-in-law and political ally, or a masterful piece of political theatre designed to impress the Alexandrians and distance himself from the murder, is open to debate. What is certain is that Caesar was not pleased. He recognized the murder for what it was, a barbaric act that also insulted Roman dignity. More practically, it robbed him of the chance to display magnanimity by pardoning his defeated foe, a gesture that had become a hallmark of his political strategy. Caesar swiftly established himself in the royal palace, much to the consternation of Ptolemy XIII's faction. He was, after all, the Roman consul, and Rome, he declared, had a vested interest in the stability of Egypt, not least because of the substantial debts Ptolemy Auletes had incurred. Citing the late king's will, which had named the Roman people as executors, Caesar announced his intention to arbitrate the ongoing dispute between Ptolemy XIII and his exiled sister Cleopatra. This was a bold assertion of Roman authority, effectively placing Egypt under his direct supervision. He demanded the disbandment of both royal armies and summoned the warring siblings to Alexandria to plead their cases before him. For Cleopatra, encamped with her army near Pelusium, this was the moment she had been waiting for. Caesar's intervention was a lifeline, a chance to bypass the entrenched power of Pothinus and Achilles and appeal directly to the ultimate arbiter of Mediterranean power. But how to reach him? Alexandria was controlled by her brother's forces, and any attempt to enter the city openly would be suicidal. Her solution, as famously recounted by Plutarch and later immortalized by Shakespeare and Hollywood, was a stroke of audacious genius, a gamble that perfectly encapsulated her daring and resourceful character. With the aid of a trusted Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, Cleopatra was smuggled into Alexandria by sea. Then, under the cover of darkness, she was allegedly concealed within a humble bedsack, some translations suggest a carpet or a sturdy laundry bag, hoisted onto Apollodorus's shoulders and carried right through the enemy lines and past the palace guards, directly into Julius Caesar's private apartments. Imagine the scene. The 52-year-old Roman general, preoccupied with the complex political and military situation, is suddenly confronted by Apollodorus, who unrolls his bundle, not to reveal bedding or wares, but the 21-year-old Queen of Egypt, emerging like a phoenix from the ashes of her recent exile. Plutarch describes Caesar as being first captivated by this proof of Cleopatra's bold wit. It was an entrance designed to impress, to signal that she was no ordinary supplicant. She hadn't come begging, she had come to claim her throne, and she had done so with a theatrical flair and personal courage that would have appealed to Caesar's own audacious spirit. This was not just a plea for assistance, it was a demonstration of her unwavering determination and her refusal to be sidelined. What followed that clandestine meeting has been the subject of romantic speculation for centuries. But beyond any immediate physical attraction, a powerful political alliance was forged that night, born of mutual necessity and perhaps a grudging respect. Caesar, a man of legendary sexual appetite, but also a supremely pragmatic politician, saw in Cleopatra a potential ally far more capable and intelligent than her boy brother. She was articulate, well-educated, and possessed an acute understanding of the political landscape. She spoke Greek fluently, the language of the Polytemic court and of Caesar himself. More importantly, she could offer him what he desperately needed: Egypt's vast wealth to finance his ongoing military campaigns and to settle the kingdom's debts to Rome. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and its granaries were crucial for feeding Rome's burgeoning population. Control of Egypt, or at least a compliant ruler on its throne, was a strategic imperative. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented salvation. He possessed the military might to crush her domestic enemies and restore her to power. An alliance with Rome's foremost general would not only secure her throne, but could also guarantee Egypt's continued, albeit diminished, autonomy in a world increasingly dominated by Roman legions. She likely presented herself not just as a wronged queen seeking justice, but as a valuable partner, a ruler who could ensure Egypt's stability and loyalty to Rome. And then there was the matter of her son, Caesarion, who would be born the following year. The prospect of a dynastic link to the most powerful man in Rome, a future where her offspring might bridge the Nile and the Tiber, must have been a tantalizing, if distant, ambition even then. The immediate consequence of their meeting was Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra's claim to the throne, insisting on the joint rule stipulated in her father's will, though with Cleopatra clearly as the senior partner. This, of course, enraged Pothinus and the faction around Ptolemy XIII. They had hoped Caesar would endorse their puppet king and depart. Instead, he had embraced their rival and was now dictating terms. The stage was set for a bitter and bloody conflict, not just for the throne of Egypt, but for the future of Roman influence in the East. The eagle from Rome had landed, and the Serpent of the Nile had coiled herself around him, forging an alliance that would shake the foundations of the ancient world.
Cleopatra's audacious return to the palace, emerging from a laundry bag, or was it a luxurious carpet, right under Julius Caesar's nose, was more than just a bold entrance. It was a declaration. She was back, and with the most powerful man in Rome now seemingly under her spell, or at least firmly in her corner, the political chessboard of Alexandria was violently overturned. Ptolemy XIII, her petulant boy brother, and his powerful puppeteers, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the ever-so-eloquent tutor Theodotus, were, to put it mildly, apoplectic. Their carefully constructed world, where they pulled the strings of a pliable young king, had just been gate-crashed by a queen who refused to be a pawn. Caesar, with his characteristic decisiveness, had declared his intention to enforce their father's will, joint rule. But everyone in Alexandria with half a political brain knew what that really meant. With Caesar backing her, Cleopatra was no junior partner, she was the main event. Pothinus, who had orchestrated the murder of Pompey, hoping to win Caesar's favor, now found his gift had backfired spectacularly. Instead of gratitude, he got a Roman general setting up shop in the royal palace and dictating terms. His attempts to undermine Cleopatra's influence with Caesar, perhaps by whispering insinuations about her ambition or her methods, proved futile. In fact, Pothinus's continued machinations and his barely concealed hostility soon became intolerable to Caesar. Sensing Pothinus was plotting against him and secretly communicating with Achilles to incite the army, Caesar had the powerful eunuch summarily executed. One down. The execution of Pothinus was the spark that ignited the tinderbox of Alexandria. Achilles, commander of the Egyptian army, a formidable force of some 20,000 men, including many seasoned Gabiniani, Roman soldiers left behind by Aulus Gabinius, who had become thoroughly Egyptianized, saw his opportunity, or perhaps his necessity. Under the pretext of defending the legitimate king, Ptolemy XIII, from the foreign interloper Caesar and the usurping queen Cleopatra, Achilles marched his army on Alexandria. Suddenly, Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the master of legions, found himself in a distinctly uncomfortable position, besieged. He was holed up in the royal palace quarter, a sprawling complex of opulent buildings, temples and gardens near the great harbour, with only his relatively small force of around 4,000 legionaries and a few hundred cavalry. He was heavily outnumbered, cut off from reinforcements, and facing a hostile city and a determined enemy army. The Alexandrian War, a bitter and desperate conflict, had begun in earnest in late 48 BC. The situation became even more deliciously complicated in a typically Ptolemaic fashion, with the dramatic intervention of Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV. This ambitious princess, likely seeing a power vacuum and a chance to claim the throne for herself, managed to escape the palace with her tutor, the eunuch Ganymedes. She joined Achilles and the forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII and was promptly proclaimed queen by the army and the ever-excitable Alexandrian mob. Now there were 3 Ptolemaic siblings vying for the crown, turning the civil war into a chaotic family reunion with swords.
Arsinoe, however, quickly proved she had inherited the family's ruthless streak. Not content to be a mere figurehead for Achilles, she soon contrived to have him assassinated, placing her own eunuch, Ganymedes, in command of her forces. It was a bold move, demonstrating that Cleopatra wasn't the only formidable woman in the Ptolemaic dynasty, though perhaps Arsinoe lacked her elder sister's finesse. Ganymedes proved to be a surprisingly capable commander, pressing the siege against Caesar with vigor and ingenuity, even managing at one point to contaminate the Roman water supply. The months that followed were a brutal slog for Caesar and Cleopatra. The fighting was fierce, often hand-to-hand in the narrow streets and along the strategic Heptastadian causeway that connected the island of Pharos, with its famous lighthouse, to the mainland. Caesar, never one to shy away from personal danger, was constantly in the thick of it. Plutarch recounts a particularly dramatic incident during a naval battle in the harbour. Caesar's boat was sunk and he was forced to leap into the sea, allegedly swimming with one hand while holding vital documents aloft with the other, his purple general's cloak clenched between his teeth to prevent the enemy from capturing it as a trophy. It's a stirring image, though one suspects a fair amount of Roman embellishment. It was during this desperate period, amidst the chaos of urban warfare, that one of the ancient world's greatest cultural tragedies allegedly occurred, the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria. The most common account, again from Roman sources, suggests that Caesar, in a bid to destroy the Egyptian fleet blockading the harbour, ordered his men to set fire to the ships. The flames, fanned by the wind, supposedly split to the docks and nearby buildings, including some warehouses that may have housed a portion of the library's vast collection of scrolls. The extent of the damage is hotly debated by historians. Some argue that the main library building, part of the Mausean complex, was largely untouched, and that only outlying storage facilities or a smaller collection near the harbour suffered. Others contend it was a catastrophic loss. What is certain is that the story of the library's burning became a potent symbol of the destructive nature of war and the fragility of human knowledge. Cleopatra, a scholar herself, must have viewed any damage to this beacon of learning with profound dismay, regardless of who was ultimately to blame. Throughout the siege, Cleopatra's role is less documented than Caesar's, but she was undoubtedly a crucial partner. She would have provided local intelligence, rallied her supporters within the besieged quarter, and perhaps offered strategic advice. Her very presence alongside Caesar was a powerful symbol, legitimizing his intervention in the eyes of some Egyptians and demonstrating her unwavering determination to reclaim her throne. The tide began to turn for Caesar in early 47 BC. Relief finally arrived in the form of an army led by Mithridates of Pergamum, a loyal ally of Caesar, who marched overland from Syria. This force, significantly augmented by Jewish troops provided by Antipater the Idumean, father of Herod the Great, who saw an opportunity to gain Roman favor, approached Alexandria from the east. Caesar, in a bold move, managed to break out of the besieged quarter, link up with Mithridates, and force a decisive confrontation. The final act played out at the Battle of the Nile in February 47 BC. Caesar's combined forces, now outnumbering the Egyptians, crushed the army nominally led by Ptolemy XIII, though likely still under Ganymedes' effective command, with Arsinoe also present. The young king, Ptolemy XIII, attempting to flee the rout, reportedly drowned in the Nile when his boat capsized under the weight of other fugitives. His body, identifiable by his golden armor, was later recovered. It was an ignominious end for the boy king, a victim of his own advisors' ambitions and the relentless currents of power. With Ptolemy XIII dead and Arsinoe IV captured, the Alexandrian War was over. Arsinoe would later be paraded in Caesar's triumph in Rome, a humiliating spectacle for a Ptolemaic princess, before being exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Her story wasn't quite finished, however. Years later, Cleopatra, ever mindful of potential rivals, would persuade Mark Antony to have her executed, a final, ruthless tidying up of dynastic loose ends. Caesar, now the undisputed master of Egypt, restored Cleopatra to the throne. However, to maintain a semblance of Ptolemaic tradition, and perhaps to provide a check on Cleopatra's power, or simply because it was the Roman way to divide and rule, he appointed her even younger brother, the 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV, as her new co-ruler and, nominally, her husband. In reality, everyone understood that Ptolemy XIV was a mere cipher. Cleopatra, backed by Roman legions and her formidable personal alliance with Caesar, was the true power in Egypt. The Serpent had not only survived the fire and fury of the Alexandrian War, but had emerged stronger, her throne secured, her enemies vanquished, and her destiny now inextricably linked with that of Rome's most powerful man. The cost had been high: a ravaged city, a possibly damaged library, and countless lives. But for Cleopatra, the prize was Egypt. The fires of the Alexandrian War had finally been quenched, the streets washed clean of blood, and the cries of battle replaced by the uneasy quiet of a city that had stared into the abyss. Julius Caesar, having decisively crushed the forces of Ptolemy XIII, was now the undisputed master of Egypt. And Cleopatra, the queen he had backed, the woman who had gambled everything on his support, was once again firmly seated on the throne of the Ptolemies. Her troublesome younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, was now fish food at the bottom of the Nile, his golden armor a rather gaudy coffin. Her ambitious sister, Arsinoe IV, was in chains, destined for the humiliating spectacle of a Roman triumph. Cleopatra had won, or rather, they had won. With the immediate political fires doused, Caesar, it seems, was in no particular hurry to leave Egypt. Perhaps the allure of its ancient mysteries, or the considerably more contemporary allure of its queen, proved a compelling reason to linger. For several weeks, possibly stretching into 2 or 3 months in the spring of 47 BC, Caesar and Cleopatra embarked on what has become one of history's most legendary river cruises. Picture this: a magnificent flotilla of perhaps hundreds of vessels, with the royal barge, the Thalamagos, at its heart, a floating palace of cedar and cypress, adorned with gold and ivory, its purple sails billowing in the gentle Nile breeze. This was no mere sightseeing tour. It was a carefully orchestrated progress, a political statement of immense significance. As they journeyed south, likely as far as Dendera or even Thebes, the ancient religious capital, it was a display of power and unity. For Caesar, it was a victory lap, a chance to survey his newest, wealthiest prize, and to impress upon the Egyptian populace the might of Rome, now personified in him. For Cleopatra, it was even more crucial. Flanked by the most powerful man in the world, she presented herself to her people not just as a Greek Ptolemaic queen, but as a true pharaoh, connected to the age-old traditions of the land. She was increasingly associating herself with the goddess Isis, the divine mother, the bringer of magic and civilization, a deity beloved by native Egyptians and whose cult was spreading throughout the Mediterranean. This Nile journey, with its attendant ceremonies and public appearances, allowed her to embody this divine role, to heal the wounds of civil war, and to cement her legitimacy. It was a masterful piece of political theatre, a symbolic fusion of Roman power and Egyptian majesty. One can only imagine the whispers along the riverbanks as the golden barge glided past, carrying the Roman general and their queen, who seemed to embody the very essence of their ancient land. But the most significant and lasting consequence of Caesar and Cleopatra's time together was far more personal, yet profoundly political. Around June 23, 47 BC, shortly after Caesar had finally departed Egypt to deal with other pressing matters in his vast, war-torn domain, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but he would become known to history by the affectionate, or perhaps slightly mocking, diminutive Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra unequivocally and very publicly declared that Julius Caesar was the father. This was no mere romantic boast, it was a political thunderclap. While Caesar, ever the pragmatic Roman politician, never officially acknowledged Caesarion as his legitimate son in a way that would grant him inheritance rights under Roman law, an act that would have been political dynamite in a republic deeply suspicious of anything resembling hereditary kingship, he did permit Cleopatra to use his name, and that in itself spoke volumes. Caesarion became a living, breathing symbol of the potent alliance between the Queen of Egypt and the Master of Rome. For Cleopatra, he represented her ultimate dynastic ambition, the potential fusion of her Ptolemaic lineage with the most powerful family in Rome. It was a breathtakingly bold vision, a future where her son might one day bridge the Nile and the Tiber, ruling over a vast Romano-Egyptian empire. One can imagine the sleepless nights this prospect caused among the conservative senators in Rome. In the summer of 46 BC, Cleopatra, now a mother and a queen whose power was inextricably linked to Rome, decided it was time to visit the heart of that power herself. Accompanied by her infant son, Caesarion, and her new, even younger, co-ruler and nominal husband, the 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV, a necessary political fig leaf, she made the journey to Rome. This was no ordinary state visit, it was a carefully calculated move to solidify her relationship with Caesar, to present her son to him, and to assert her status on the world stage.
Caesar, now at the zenith of his power, having celebrated 4 magnificent triumphs for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, received her with all the honor due to a valued ally, and perhaps something more. He housed Cleopatra and her entourage not within the city limits, which might have caused undue offense to Roman sensibilities, but in his lavish private villa across the Tiber River, amidst his magnificent gardens, the Horti Caesaris. This was still a very public statement of their special relationship. And then, in an act that caused considerable scandal and confirmed the worst fears of many traditionalist Romans, Caesar commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra, not merely as a queen, but in the guise of Isis, and had it placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix. This temple was a sacred space, dedicated to Venus as the divine ancestress of Caesar's own Julian clan. To place the image of a foreign queen, his lover, within such a hallowed precinct was an audacious, almost defiant gesture. It was a public declaration of her importance to her, and perhaps a hint at the divine status he was beginning to cultivate for himself. The Roman reaction to Cleopatra's presence, which lasted for nearly 2 years, was a cocktail of fascination, admiration, resentment, and outright hostility. The common people may have been intrigued by the exotic queen and her retinue, the tales of Egypt's fabulous wealth, and the undeniable glamour that surrounded her. But among the Roman elite, particularly the staunchly Republican senators, her influence over Caesar was a source of deep suspicion and anxiety. The famed orator and statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero, a man who embodied the old Republican virtues, made no secret of his disdain. In his letters to his friend Atticus, Cicero complained bitterly of Cleopatra's arrogance. He wrote, "Her queenly airs I cannot recall without a pang. The queen's insolence, too, when she was living in Caesar's trans-Tiberine villa, I cannot recall without a pang." He also grumbled about an unfulfilled promise from her regarding some rare books from the library of Alexandria, a slight that clearly stung his scholarly pride.
Her promises about the books, he lamented, I should be glad to see fulfilled, but that is a matter for Philadelphus to see to.
Cicero's animosity was likely shared by many who saw Cleopatra as a symbol of everything they feared: the corrupting influence of Eastern luxury, the spectre of monarchy, and Caesar's seemingly limitless ambition. Her regal bearing, her intelligence, her very public liaison with Caesar, and the honors he bestowed upon her, all fueled the narrative that Caesar was drifting away from Roman traditions, perhaps even aspiring to become a king, with Cleopatra as his queen. Her visit, intended to cement her power and her son's future, also inadvertently fanned the flames of the conspiracy that was already coalescing against Caesar. The Serpent of the Nile, in the heart of Rome, was a dazzling and dangerous spectacle, a queen whose destiny was now more tightly bound than ever to the fate of the man who ruled the world. The air in Rome was thick with intrigue, and the ground beneath Caesar's feet was becoming increasingly unstable.
The Roman air, thick with intrigue and the simmering resentment of senators who saw their republic crumbling under the weight of one man's ambition, finally reached its deadly boiling point. Cleopatra was still residing in Caesar's lavish villa across the Tiber, a golden cage in a city that both fascinated and feared her, when the unthinkable happened. On the Ides of March 44 BC, March 15th, a day that would live in infamy, Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life, conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome, was brutally assassinated. Stabbed 23 times by a conspiracy of senators, men he had pardoned, men he had promoted, men who called themselves liberators, he fell at the foot of a statue of his former rival, Pompey the Great. The irony would not have been lost on the gods or on Cleopatra. Caesar's death was not just the end of a life, it was the shattering of an epoch. For Cleopatra, it was a cataclysm. Her most powerful Roman ally, the father of her son, the guarantor of her throne and Egypt's fragile autonomy, was gone. In an instant, the carefully constructed edifice of her political future, built on her unique relationship with Caesar, crumbled. Her position in Rome, already precarious and viewed with suspicion by many, became untenable, even dangerous. The daggers that pierced Caesar's body were aimed indirectly at her as well, and at the future she had envisioned for Caesarion as a bridge between two mighty empires. In Caesar's will, read publicly shortly after his death, there was a crushing omission. His grandnephew, the 19-year-old Octavian, was named as his principal adopted son and heir. Caesarion, little Caesar, was not mentioned. The message was brutally clear. In the eyes of Roman law and official succession, Cleopatra's son by Caesar was at best a foreign irrelevance, at worst a dangerous pretender. With Rome descending into a maelstrom of political chaos, grief and recrimination, Cleopatra acted with the swift, pragmatic decisiveness that had become her hallmark. There was no time for protracted mourning or diplomatic niceties. Her safety, and more importantly, the safety of her nearly 3-year-old son, was paramount. Within weeks, likely by mid-April 44 BC, she and her entourage, including the young Ptolemy XIV and Caesarion, had made a discreet but rapid departure from Rome, sailing back to the relative sanctuary of Alexandria. The Serpent, sensing mortal danger, was retreating to her lair.
Upon her return to Egypt, Cleopatra moved with chilling efficiency to consolidate her power and eliminate any potential threats or rivals who might be exploited by the warring Roman factions. Her younger brother and nominal co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, then around 15 years old, was a significant liability.
He was of an age where he could be presented as an alternative, more pliable ruler by those in Alexandria or Rome who wished to unseat her. Around July of 44 BC, shortly after their return, Ptolemy XIV disappeared from the historical record. Ancient sources, including the historian Josephus, strongly suggest he died an unnatural death, likely poisoned on Cleopatra's orders. While direct proof is lacking, the timing and the political expediency are highly suggestive. Cleopatra had learned from the bloody history of her own dynasty, and indeed from her father's execution of her sister Berene, that sentimentality had no place in the brutal calculus of Ptolemaic power. Significantly, it was around this time that Cleopatra dropped the traditional Ptolemaic royal epithet, Philadelphos, brother-loving or sister-loving, from her official titles. A rather pointed statement, one might think. With Ptolemy XIV conveniently out of the picture, Cleopatra moved to elevate her son, Caesarion, to the status of co-regent. He became Ptolemy XV, Caesar, his name now officially linked to the most revered and, for some, the most feared name in Rome. Inscriptions and reliefs from this period, such as those at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, depict Cleopatra and Caesarion making offerings to the gods together. He as a young pharaoh, she as his powerful queen mother, often in the guise of Isis. This was not just about securing her own rule, it was about legitimizing her son, positioning him as the true heir to Egypt, and, subtly, persistently, reminding the world of his Caesarian lineage. She was playing a long game, and Caesarion was her most valuable piece. The years immediately following Caesar's assassination, from 44 to 41 BC, saw the Roman world once again convulsed by civil war. This time it was the liberators, Caesar's assassins, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, pitted against the Second Triumvirate, an uneasy alliance formed by Caesar's heir Octavian, his loyal general Mark Antony, and the less influential Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Cleopatra had to navigate these treacherous waters with extreme caution. Officially, she declared her support for the Caesarian faction, the Triumvirs. She dispatched the 4 Roman legions that Caesar had left stationed in Egypt to support Publius Cornelius Dolabella, a Caesarian loyalist fighting in Syria. However, these legions were intercepted and captured by Cassius, a significant blow to her efforts. Further complicating matters, her own governor of Cyprus, a man named Serapion, apparently acting in collusion with Cleopatra's exiled and still ambitious sister Arsinoe IV, provided ships to Cassius. Despite these setbacks, Cleopatra reportedly attempted to personally lead her fleet to Greece to aid Antony and Octavian before the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, but a violent storm forced her ships back to Egypt. Her loyalties, at least on paper, were clear, but her ability to project power beyond Egypt's borders was, for the moment, constrained. Internally, Egypt faced its own severe trials during this period. The life-giving Nile, the source of Egypt's wealth and sustenance, failed to deliver adequate floods for several consecutive years, between 43 and 41 BC. The result was widespread famine, and with famine often came its grim companion, plague. Such calamities were often interpreted by the populace as signs of divine displeasure, a dangerous sentiment for any ruler. Cleopatra, however, responded with energy and competence. She ordered the royal granaries to be opened to distribute food to the suffering population. She took measures to propitiate the gods, particularly Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess associated with pestilence, whose cult was prominent. She also reportedly supported medical research into the plague, with her advisor, the physician Dioscurides Phacus, taking a leading role. Officials like Callimachos of Thebes were praised in inscriptions for their effective anti-famine measures. Through such decisive actions, Cleopatra managed to maintain a degree of internal stability, preventing the widespread riots and rebellions that had so often plagued her predecessors during similar crises. Her focus was on practical governance, on demonstrating to her people that she was a capable and caring ruler, even as the world around her descended into chaos.
Amidst these political and natural crises, Cleopatra also continued her ambitious building programs. These were not mere vanity projects. They were carefully designed to reinforce her legitimacy and that of her son. She initiated or continued work on significant structures like the Caesareum in Alexandria, a temple originally intended to honor Caesar, but which she likely repurposed to emphasize Caesarion's connection to his deified father. She also focused on her own tomb, a monument that would, in time, become legendary. The reliefs commissioned at the Dendera temple complex, depicting her and Caesarion as equals before the Egyptian gods, were powerful visual propaganda, reinforcing their joint rule and her divine status as the living Isis. A tour of the country with the young Caesarion further solidified their image as legitimate pharaohs, deeply connected to the ancient traditions of the land. Cleopatra's actions in these turbulent years reveal a ruler of extraordinary resilience, political astuteness, and ruthless determination. She had not only survived the catastrophic loss of her greatest Roman ally, but had skillfully navigated the treacherous power struggles that followed. She had secured her throne, eliminated internal rivals, managed severe domestic crises, and consistently promoted the legitimacy of her son. The Serpent had indeed returned to the Nile, not just to survive, but to consolidate her power, biding her time, ever watchful for the next opportunity to engage with the Roman titans who were once again battling for control of the world. That opportunity would soon arrive, in the formidable shape of another Roman eagle, Mark Antony. The daggers that felled Julius Caesar on the Ides of March did more than just end a life. They plunged the Roman Republic, yet again, into the abyss of civil war. The liberators, as Caesar's assassins styled themselves, led by the high-minded Marcus Junius Brutus and the pragmatic Gaius Cassius Longinus, envisioned a restoration of the old republic. But Caesar's ghost and his legacy proved far too potent. His legions, his veterans, and vast swathes of the populace were not about to forgive or forget. From the ensuing chaos, 3 men eventually rose to fill the power vacuum, forging an uneasy and ultimately temporary alliance known as the Second Triumvirate in November of 43 BC. First among them was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, a young man of barely 19 when Caesar was killed. He was a sickly, often underestimated youth, but possessed of a chillingly astute political mind and an iron will. Crucially, Caesar's will had named him as his adopted son and principal heir, bestowing upon him the potent name Caesar, a name he would wield like a weapon. He became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or simply Octavian. Then there was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a former master of the horse under Caesar, a man of some influence, but ultimately the weakest link in this powerful trio, destined to be overshadowed and eventually sidelined by his more formidable colleagues. And finally, there was Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. A charismatic, battle-hardened general, Antony had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, his right-hand man in Gaul and during the civil war against Pompey. He was renowned for his military prowess, his boisterous camaraderie with his soldiers, and his rather flamboyant, some might say decadent, lifestyle. Antony was a man of great appetites, for power, for pleasure, for glory. He was also a man who, unlike the calculating Octavian, often seemed to wear his heart on his sleeve, capable of great loyalty and equally great passion.
Plutarch, in his Life of Antony, describes him as having a noble presence, with a masculine beauty and a boldness of speech that appealed to soldiers, though his Asiatic style of oratory, his buffoonery, and his love of ostentation were less admired by the more austere Roman elite. Together, these three triumvirs unleashed a brutal wave of proscriptions, a legalized reign of terror, eliminating their political enemies in Rome and confiscating their wealth to fund their armies. Their primary target, Caesar's assassins. In 42 BC, at the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia, the forces of Antony and Octavian decisively crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Both liberators chose suicide over capture, and with their deaths, the dream of restoring the old republic effectively died as well.
With their common enemies vanquished, the triumvirs carved up the vast Roman world amongst themselves. Octavian, despite his youth and relative lack of military experience, cannily secured control of Italy and the western provinces. Lepidus was eventually shunted off to Africa. And Mark Antony, the seasoned soldier, the man who had played the decisive role at Philippi, received what many considered the choicest prize: the wealthy, populous, and strategically vital eastern provinces. This vast domain stretched from Greece and Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, through Syria and the Levant, and included the crucial client kingdoms on Rome's periphery, most notably Egypt. Antony now faced the monumental task of reorganizing this sprawling eastern realm, settling its affairs after years of war, and, most pressingly, raising funds and preparing for a long-cherished Roman ambition, a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire. The Parthians, a powerful Iranian kingdom, were Rome's most formidable eastern rival, having inflicted a humiliating defeat on Roman legions under Crassus at Carrhae some years earlier. A successful Parthian war would bring Antony immense glory, unimaginable wealth, and potentially supreme power in Rome. But such an undertaking required staggering resources: men, money, and supplies. And the richest jewel in Antony's newly acquired eastern crown, the kingdom that could provide much of what he needed, was Egypt. Egypt, under the astute rule of Queen Cleopatra VII, had remained relatively stable, if watchful, during Rome's latest convulsions. She had, as we've seen, officially backed the Caesarean cause, though her material support had been somewhat thwarted. Now, with Antony in charge of the East, the Queen of the Nile found herself in a familiar yet subtly different position. Once again, her kingdom's fate was intertwined with that of a powerful Roman warlord. But Antony was not Caesar. While Caesar had been a patrician intellectual with an aura of cool command, Antony was a more flamboyant, earthy figure, known for his charisma and his more overtly Hellenistic tastes, often styling himself as a new Dionysus or Heracles. In 41 BC, Antony, having established his headquarters in Tarsus, a bustling city in Cilicia on the southern coast of Asia Minor, began to summon the various client rulers of the East. Among them, inevitably, was Cleopatra. The official pretext for her summons was to answer charges that she had, during the recent civil war, provided aid to Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins. This was a politically delicate accusation, given Antony's role as Caesar's avenger and his need to appear tough on any perceived enemies of the Caesarean faction. Some sources suggest that Dellius, Antony's envoy, also hinted that Antony was already smitten by reports of her beauty and intelligence, and eager to meet the woman who had captivated the great Julius Caesar. Cleopatra, now a woman of 28 or 29, a seasoned ruler who had navigated multiple crises and consolidated her power with ruthless efficiency, understood the summons for what it was, a command performance, but also a golden opportunity. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and resources for his Parthian campaign.
She, in turn, needed a powerful Roman patron to guarantee Egypt's continued autonomy, to protect her throne from internal and external threats, and, crucially, to advance the interests of her son, Caesarion, whom she still proclaimed as Caesar's true heir. She also likely recognized in Antony a personality perhaps more simpatico to her own than the reserved Caesar had been. A man who appreciated grandeur, who understood the theatricality of power, and who might be more susceptible to her unique blend of charm, intellect, and regal presence. She did not rush to Tarsus. Instead, she made Antony wait, a calculated delay designed to heighten his anticipation and to underscore her own status as a sovereign queen, not a mere vassal. When she finally prepared to make her journey, she did so with a clear understanding that this meeting would be pivotal. It was not just about defending herself against accusations. It was about forging a new alliance, securing her kingdom's future, and perhaps finding a new partner in power. The eagle from Rome had summoned the Serpent of the Nile, and Cleopatra, ever the strategist, was preparing to make an entrance that Antony and history would never forget.
Mark Antony, now the de facto ruler of Rome's vast eastern territories, had established his headquarters in Tarsus, a bustling port city in Cilicia on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. From here, he dispensed justice, reorganized provinces, and, most importantly, gathered the sinews of war for his planned invasion of Parthia. He had summoned the various client kings and potentates of the East to account for their loyalties during the recent Roman civil wars and, not incidentally, to pledge their resources to his upcoming campaign. Among those summoned was Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. The official charge was to explain her alleged support for Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins. But everyone, including Antony and Cleopatra, knew this was about much more than a simple interrogation. It was a high-stakes audition, a diplomatic dance that could redefine the power map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra, with a characteristic flair for the dramatic and a keen understanding of Antony's particular sensibilities, did not simply arrive, she orchestrated an entrance. She knew Antony. She knew of his reputation as a man who appreciated grandeur, who was susceptible to spectacle, and who saw himself as a new Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. Caesar had been captivated by her wit and daring when she arrived in a bedsack. For Antony, a man of more flamboyant tastes, she would conjure something altogether more divine, more intoxicating. Having made Antony wait, heightening his anticipation, Cleopatra finally sailed up the Cydnus River to Tarsus in the late summer of 41 BC. Her arrival was not that of a supplicant queen coming to plead her case, but of a goddess gracing mortals with her presence. The description of this event, immortalized by Plutarch in his Life of Antony, remains one of the most evocative set pieces in ancient history, a testament to Cleopatra's genius for self-presentation. Plutarch tells us she came sailing up the river in a barge with a gilded stern and outspread sails of purple, while oars of silver beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. She herself, he writes, lay all along under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a picture, and beautiful young boys, like painted cupids, stood on each side to fan her. Her maids were dressed like sea nymphs and graces, some steering at the rudder, some working at the ropes. The perfumes diffused themselves from the vessel to the shore, which was covered with multitudes. Antony, who was seated in the public marketplace awaiting her, found himself abandoned as the entire populace of Tarsus flocked to the riverbank to witness this astonishing spectacle. Word was sent that Venus had come to feast with Bacchus, that is, Aphrodite with Dionysus, for the good of Asia.
It was an act of breathtaking audacity and brilliant political theatre.
By appearing as Aphrodite Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, she was not merely showcasing her own allure, she was subtly elevating herself to divine status, a common practice for Hellenistic monarchs, but one that would particularly resonate with Antony's Dionysian persona. She was also, in a way, outmaneuvering him. Antony had summoned her as a Roman general would summon a client ruler. She responded by arriving as a goddess, effectively compelling him to acknowledge her divine aura. He had expected her to come to his tribunal. Instead, the entire city went to her. As Plutarch notes, Antony sent to invite her to supper, but she thought it fitter he should come to her. A small detail, but a significant assertion of her own standing. Antony, perhaps amused, perhaps intrigued, perhaps already smitten, accepted the invitation. The suppers that followed, hosted by Cleopatra, were legendary for their opulence and extravagance. Plutarch again, the Cydnus itself bore witness to the magnificence of the preparations, for she feasted Antony and his friends, and the expense was beyond belief. She filled the banqueting halls with roses knee-deep, illuminated the nights with countless lamps arranged in intricate patterns, and lavished gifts upon Antony's officers. She was demonstrating not just her personal charm, but the immense wealth and resources of Egypt, subtly reminding Antony of what she and her kingdom could offer him. During these encounters, Cleopatra employed all her famed wit, intelligence, and, as Plutarch emphasizes, the irresistible charm of her conversation and the sweetness in the tones of her voice. He makes a point of saying that her actual physical beauty was not in itself so remarkable that none could be compared with her, or that no one could see her without being struck by it, but it was the contact of her presence, if you lived with her, that was irresistible. It was her charisma, her intellect, her playful humor, and her ability to adapt her conversation to any mood or subject that truly captivated Antony. He was, by all accounts, a man who enjoyed life's pleasures, and Cleopatra, it seemed, could provide them in abundance, seasoned with a sharp mind and a regal bearing.
The charges against her, of having aided Cassius, were quickly dismissed, if they were ever seriously pressed. How could a goddess be held to account by a mere mortal general, however powerful? Soon, the political alliance and the personal relationship were firmly established. Antony, far from punishing the Queen of Egypt, found himself utterly enchanted by her. He agreed to support her rule, and she, in turn, pledged the resources of Egypt to his cause, particularly his much-anticipated Parthian campaign. It was a partnership born of mutual advantage. Antony needed Egypt's gold, grain, and ships. Cleopatra needed Roman military backing to secure her throne against internal rivals and to protect Egypt from outright Roman annexation. Antony was so captivated that he decided to spend the winter of 4140 BC with Cleopatra in Alexandria. This was a significant political statement in itself, choosing the splendors of the Egyptian capital over his duties in other parts of his vast eastern command. And what a winter it must have been! Alexandria, with its vibrant intellectual life, its luxurious palaces, and its cosmopolitan populace, provided the perfect backdrop for their burgeoning relationship. Together, they founded a rather notorious dining society they called the Animita, or the Inimitable Livers. Accounts vary as to its exact nature. Some Roman propagandists later portrayed it as a den of drunken debauchery, a testament to Antony's supposed moral decline under Cleopatra's exotic influence.
More sympathetic interpretations, drawing from Plutarch, suggest it was a society dedicated to a life of refined pleasure and extravagant banqueting, perhaps with Dionysian undertones, where members vied with each other in the magnificence of their entertainments. Plutarch recounts tales of their Alexandrian days, filled with feasting, drinking, hunting, and dicing. Cleopatra, he says, was Antony's constant companion, whether he were serious or mirthful. She accompanied him on his military exercises and even joined him in his notorious nighttime escapades, where they would dress as servants and roam the city, playing pranks on unsuspecting citizens, often returning with bangs and bruises. The Alexandrians, Plutarch notes rather dryly, liked Antony's convivial follies. It was a period of seemingly carefree indulgence, but beneath the surface, a powerful political and personal bond was being forged. Antony was falling deeply under Cleopatra's spell, not just as a lover, but as an intellectual equal and a vital political partner.
In the spring of 40 BC, as Antony prepared to leave Egypt to attend to pressing matters in Italy, including patching up his increasingly strained relationship with Octavian, Cleopatra was pregnant. Later that year, while Antony was in Rome, she gave birth to twins, a boy, Alexander Helios, Alexander the Sun, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the Moon. The names themselves were rich with symbolism, evoking Hellenistic royal traditions, divine associations, and perhaps a vision of a vast empire ruled by their progeny, stretching from the rising to the setting sun. The sun and moon, cosmic powers, born to a queen who styled herself Isis, and a Roman general who emulated Dionysus. It was a potent declaration of their shared ambition. The Tarsus spectacle had achieved everything Cleopatra could have hoped for, and more. She had not only secured her throne and a powerful Roman ally, but had also captivated the man who now held the fate of the East in his hands. Their alliance, born amidst a blaze of calculated theatricality and genuine personal chemistry, would reshape the political landscape of the Roman world, setting them on a glittering but ultimately perilous path towards a destiny that would become the stuff of legend. The intoxicating winter of 41–40 BC in Alexandria, a whirlwind of inimitable living, feasting, and shared political ambition, eventually had to yield to the harsh realities of Roman power politics. As spring unfurled across the Mediterranean, Mark Antony, leaving behind a pregnant Cleopatra, sailed from Egypt. Pressing matters demanded his attention in Italy. The Roman world, despite the uneasy truce of the Second Triumvirate, was still a cauldron of simmering tensions. His own wife, the formidable Fulvia, a woman of fierce political instincts, had, in conjunction with Antony's brother Lucius Antonius, instigated a desperate and ill-fated conflict against Octavian, the Perusine War. It was a messy affair, ending in defeat for Antony's partisans and further straining the already frayed relationship between the two most powerful triumvirs. News of these disturbances, and perhaps a dawning awareness that his eastern dalliances were providing ample ammunition for his rivals in Rome, compelled Antony's return. Upon his arrival in Italy, Fulvia conveniently died, removing one source of political embarrassment. To mend the fractured alliance with Octavian, a new pact was forged, the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC. And as was often the Roman way, this political reconciliation was cemented with a dynastic marriage. Antony, the charismatic general, the supposed new Dionysus, agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's elder sister. Octavia was the very model of Roman matronly virtue, beautiful, cultured, loyal, and universally respected. She was, in essence, the anti-Cleopatra,
a living embodiment of the traditional Roman values Antony was increasingly accused of abandoning. One can only imagine Cleopatra's reaction back in Alexandria when news of this marriage reached her. Shakespeare, in Antony and Cleopatra, memorably depicts her erupting in a jealous rage, physically striking the unfortunate messenger who bears the tidings and demanding to know every detail of Octavia's appearance, only finding solace when assured of her rival's supposed plainness. While Shakespeare's portrayal is undoubtedly heightened for dramatic effect, it likely captures the core of Cleopatra's very real political and personal anxieties. Antony's marriage to Octavia was not just a personal betrayal, it was a significant strategic setback. It signaled a potential shift in Antony's loyalties, a strengthening of his ties to Rome and to Octavian, and a potential marginalization of Cleopatra and her ambitions for her children by Antony, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born later that year while Antony was dutifully playing the Roman husband.
For the next 3.5 years, from late 40 BC until the middle of 37 BC, Antony remained largely absent from Egypt and from Cleopatra's side. He lived with Octavia, who bore him 2 daughters, Antonia Major, grandmother of Emperor Nero, and Antonia Minor, mother of Emperor Claudius and grandmother of Emperor Caligula. He attempted, with Octavia's devoted support, to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman politics and to maintain the fragile peace with Octavian. During this period, Cleopatra, though undoubtedly frustrated by Antony's prolonged absence and his Roman marriage, focused her formidable energies on governing her kingdom. Egypt, enriched by territories such as Cyprus and parts of Cilicia, likely granted to her during their initial alliance in Tarsus, remained a beacon of stability and prosperity in a turbulent region. She continued to manage Egypt's complex economy, oversee its administration, and further cultivate her image as a divine ruler, the living Isis, devoted to the welfare of her people. Her most significant regional rival, Herod of Judea, was conveniently preoccupied with his own civil war, which kept him from posing any immediate threat to Egyptian interests. But the reconciliation between Antony and Octavian was at best a superficial truce. Their ambitions were too vast, their personalities too different, and their mutual suspicion too deep for any lasting peace. By 37 BC, Antony, increasingly convinced that a final confrontation with Octavian was inevitable and desperately needing resources for his long-delayed and critically important Parthian campaign, made a decisive break. He effectively separated from Octavia, though he did not formally divorce her for several more years, a slight that Octavian would later exploit with devastating effect in his propaganda war. Antony summoned Cleopatra to join him in Antioch, the great Syrian metropolis that served as his eastern headquarters. Their reunion in Antioch marked the definitive rekindling of their personal and political partnership. It was a clear signal to the Roman world that Antony was once again aligning his destiny with the Queen of Egypt. It is likely that around this time, Antony and Cleopatra contracted some form of marriage according to Egyptian custom, though it would not have been recognized under Roman law, where Antony was still legally wed to Octavia. This renewed alliance was swiftly blessed with another child, a son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, born in 36 BC. His name, brother/sister-loving, was a traditional Ptolemaic royal epithet, further emphasizing the dynastic ambitions of their union. In return for her unwavering loyalty and material aid, and perhaps to bolster his own prestige after the Parthian debacle, Antony bestowed upon Cleopatra and her children vast territories in the east. These grants, sometimes referred to as the donations of Antioch, effectively reconstituted much of the former Ptolemaic sphere of influence.
Cleopatra received control over Cyprus, Crete, Cyrene in Libya, significant portions of Syria and Phoenicia, parts of Cilicia, and even the lucrative balsam groves of Jericho, which Antony carved out of Herod's kingdom of Judea, a move that did little to endear him to the Judean king. These territorial acquisitions were of immense strategic and economic importance. They dramatically increased Egypt's resources and reaffirmed Cleopatra's status as a major Hellenistic monarch. It was a clear statement of their shared imperial ambitions. So significant was this expansion of her realm that Cleopatra reportedly initiated a new system of dating her reign from this point, marking it as a new era of Ptolemaic power and resurgence. The apogee of their shared vision, and the act that would serve as the ultimate provocation to Octavian and traditional Roman sensibilities, was the spectacular ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, staged in the autumn of 34 BC. Following a more successful, though limited, military campaign in Armenia, Antony celebrated a mock Roman triumph in Alexandria, an unprecedented and, in Roman eyes, deeply offensive act, as triumphs were traditionally celebrated only in Rome. In the city's grand gymnasium, before a vast assembly, Antony and Cleopatra appeared on golden thrones. She dressed in the sacred robes of Isis, he in the attire of Dionysus Osiris. Their children were also present, arrayed as royalty.
Here, Antony made a series of breathtaking declarations. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, now a teenager, was proclaimed King of Kings and, most significantly, the true and legitimate son and heir of the deified Julius Caesar, a direct and unmistakable challenge to Octavian's status as Caesar's adopted son and heir. Cleopatra herself was hailed as Queen of Kings, Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Coele-Syria, her authority seemingly elevated above all other client monarchs. Their own children by Antony were also granted magnificent, if somewhat theoretical, kingdoms. Alexander Helios was named King of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, the latter two still unconquered. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was made Queen of Cyrenaica and Libya, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus was declared King of Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. These donations were far more than a theatrical display of affection or family pride. They were a radical redrawing of the political map of the East, a blueprint for a vast Romano-Egyptian empire ruled jointly by Antony and Cleopatra and their heirs, with Alexandria, not Rome, as its glittering capital. It was a vision of a Hellenistic renaissance, a challenge to Rome's singular dominance, and a direct affront to Octavian's ambitions and Roman tradition. For Octavian, watching from Rome, the donations of Alexandria were not just political folly, they were tantamount to a declaration of war. The serpent of the Nile and the Roman eagle she had ensnared were now charting a course that could only lead to a final cataclysmic confrontation for control of the entire Roman world.
The Donations of Alexandria, that grandiose spectacle of 34 BC, where Antony and Cleopatra carved up kingdoms for their children and proclaimed Caesarion the true heir of Julius Caesar, were more than just a lavish display of imperial ambition. In Rome, they were received as a calculated insult, a brazen challenge to Roman authority, and the ultimate gift to Octavian's burgeoning propaganda machine. For years, an uneasy truce had held between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east, a peace punctuated by mutual suspicion and increasingly venomous rhetoric. But the donations shattered any remaining semblance of accord. The Cold War of words was about to turn scorching hot, and at the heart of the inferno, Octavian skillfully placed the figure of Cleopatra. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was a young man of extraordinary political cunning, a master manipulator of public opinion, who understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, that wars are fought not just with legions and fleets, but with narratives. He recognized that to rally a deeply traditionalist Roman populace and a wary Senate behind a potentially devastating civil war against a figure as renowned as Mark Antony, he needed more than just political grievances. He needed a villain. And Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the Serpent of the Nile, was perfectly cast for the role. From his power base in Rome, Octavian launched a relentless and brilliantly orchestrated campaign of character assassination. Antony, the once heroic Roman general, was portrayed as a man utterly bewitched, a noble Roman soul ensnared and corrupted by the exotic wiles and dark magic of an Eastern sorceress. He was depicted as having gone native, abandoning Roman virtue and dignity, surrendering his Roman identity to become the effeminate consort of a foreign despot. Poets and orators in Octavian's employ, like Horace and Propertius, churned out verses depicting Cleopatra as a monstrous figure, a fatal monster, Horace, Odes 137, a drunken, power-mad harlot scheming to subjugate Rome and transfer the capital of the empire to Alexandria. Propertius lamented Rome being shamed by a woman's sway, decrying Cleopatra as a queen who demands from a besotted husband the walls of Rome and the Senate bound to her sway. The themes were carefully chosen to resonate with deep-seated Roman prejudices: fear of powerful women in politics, disdain for Eastern luxury and decadence, which were seen as antithetical to Roman austerity and discipline, and a profound xenophobia, particularly towards Egypt, which, despite its wealth and ancient lineage, was often viewed by Romans with a mixture of fascination and contempt. Cleopatra was the embodiment of these fears, the Egyptian woman, as Octavian's propaganda often derisively called her, who dared to challenge Roman supremacy.
One of Octavian's most potent weapons was Antony's relationship with Octavia, Octavian's own sister. Antony's marriage to Octavia in 40 BC had been a political necessity, a temporary glue holding the triumvirate together. But his subsequent abandonment of her for Cleopatra provided Octavian with a powerful emotional and moral argument. Octavia was portrayed as the virtuous, wronged Roman wife, a symbol of traditional family values, callously cast aside by a husband lost to foreign temptation. This narrative conveniently overlooked the political machinations that had driven Antony and Octavia apart, and the fact that Antony, for several years, had treated Octavia with respect. But in the heated climate of propaganda, nuance was the first casualty. The masterstroke of Octavian's campaign came in 32 BC. Antony, finally pushed to the brink, formally divorced Octavia. This was the moment Octavian had been waiting for. He used it to further inflame public opinion against Antony. Then, in an act of dubious legality but immense political impact, Octavian seized Antony's will from the sacrosanct keeping of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. He read its contents aloud to the Senate and, selectively, to the Roman people. The will, according to Octavian's carefully curated presentation, contained several damning provisions. It confirmed the donations of Alexandria, acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate son, and, most shockingly to Roman sensibilities, expressed Antony's wish to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra. Whether these were Antony's true intentions or clever forgeries and exaggerations by Octavian is still debated by historians. Some scholars, like Pat Southern, argue that the will was likely genuine and reflected Antony's commitment to his Eastern power base and his family with Cleopatra. Others suggest Octavian may have embellished or entirely fabricated key elements to maximize their shock value. Regardless of its authenticity, the public reading of the will was a propaganda coup. It seemed to confirm every accusation Octavian had leveled against Antony: that he was no longer truly Roman, that he prioritized his foreign queen and her bastard son over his legitimate Roman heirs and his Roman homeland, and that he envisioned an Eastern empire with Alexandria as its center. The desire to be buried in Alexandria was particularly offensive. It was seen as a betrayal of Roman tradition and a symbolic severing of his ties to his ancestral land.
The effect was electric. Public outrage, skillfully fanned by Octavian, reached fever pitch. The Senate, now firmly under Octavian's sway, stripped Antony of his triumviral powers and, crucially, declared war. But here Octavian played another clever hand. He did not declare war on Antony directly, which might have been perceived as another Roman civil war, a prospect many Romans dreaded. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra. This masterfully reframed the conflict not as an internal Roman power struggle, but as a patriotic war against a foreign enemy, a dangerous queen who threatened the very existence of Rome. Antony, by siding with her, became a traitor to his own people. As the historian Cassius Dio, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, put it, Octavian ensured that the Roman people should not appear to be fighting against Antony, but against Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra were not entirely silent in this war of words, though their efforts were ultimately less effective in the West. They issued their own coinage, often depicting Antony with Cleopatra, sometimes with him styled as the new Dionysus and her as Isis, emphasizing their divine partnership and their rule over a vast eastern domain. These coins were, in themselves, a form of propaganda, projecting an image of power, prosperity, and dynastic continuity. They likely attempted to counter Octavian's narrative by portraying him as a ruthless usurper, a man who had betrayed Caesar's true legacy and was plunging Rome into yet another destructive conflict for his own personal gain. They might have highlighted Antony's military achievements and his generosity, contrasting it with Octavian's perceived coldness and ambition. However, Antony and Cleopatra were at a distinct disadvantage. Octavian controlled Rome, the heart of the information network. His narrative, disseminated through official channels, public speeches, literature, and even popular rumor, dominated the Western Mediterranean. Antony's responses, originating from Alexandria or his eastern headquarters, struggled to penetrate this wall of hostile propaganda. Furthermore, Antony's own actions, such as the donations of Alexandria and his increasingly orientalized public image, often played directly into Octavian's hands, seeming to confirm the very accusations leveled against him. The propaganda war was more than just an exchange of insults. It was a critical battle for the hearts and minds of the Roman people, and crucially, for the loyalty of the legions. Octavian's success in demonizing Cleopatra and portraying Antony as her enthralled puppet was instrumental in consolidating his support, isolating his rival, and legitimizing the final, inevitable military showdown. Words in this epic struggle proved to be as formidable as any weapon, shaping perceptions, forging allegiances, and ultimately paving the way for the clash of empires that would decide the fate of the Roman world. Octavian's propaganda and Antony's own political missteps had successfully branded them enemies of Rome. By 32 BC, Octavian, backed by the Senate and a popular oath of allegiance, declared war, cleverly on Cleopatra, not Antony. This framed the conflict as a foreign war against a dangerous Eastern queen, casting Antony as a traitor for siding with her. Both sides marshalled immense forces. Antony and Cleopatra wintered in Patrae, Greece, 32-31 BC, amassing a formidable army and a fleet of some 500 warships, including Cleopatra's own well-equipped Egyptian squadron. Cleopatra was a crucial, active partner in this build-up, financing it with Egypt's treasury, reportedly contributing a significant 20,000 talents and participating directly in war councils. Meanwhile, Octavian's brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a master strategist, quickly seized the initiative. Throughout the spring and summer of 31 BC, Agrippa captured key coastal bases loyal to Antony, effectively disrupting his supply lines and tracking his main fleet within the Ambracian Gulf near Actium. Antony and Cleopatra found themselves increasingly isolated, their massive army suffering from shortages of food and supplies, their fleet blockaded, and disease taking its toll on their land-bound forces. Dismayed by Antony's apparent subservience to Cleopatra, strategic blunders, and the deteriorating situation, several of Antony's key Roman allies, like Lucius Munatius Plancus and Marcus Titius, defected to Octavian. They provided valuable intelligence and spread damaging stories about Cleopatra's overbearing influence and Antony's decadent lifestyle, further fueling Octavian's propaganda. Faced with this tightening noose, Antony and Cleopatra had to make a critical decision: risk a land battle or attempt a naval breakout. They chose to fight at sea. Hostile ancient sources often blame Cleopatra for this choice, suggesting she insisted on a naval battle for an easier escape or because she trusted her fleet. More pragmatic military considerations likely played a role. Their land forces were already weakened, and a naval victory offered the only chance to break Agrippa's blockade and regain the strategic initiative, perhaps by regrouping in Egypt. On September 2, 31 BC, the fateful Battle of Actium commenced. Antony's generally larger and heavier warships confronted Agrippa's smaller, more agile Liburnian galleys. For hours, a chaotic and brutal battle raged. The larger Antonian ships found themselves outmaneuvered by Agrippa's lighter vessels, which could dart in, inflict damage with rams or missiles by targeting rudders and oars, and then retreat before the heavier ships could effectively respond.
Then came the controversial and much debated turning point. Cleopatra, with her squadron of 60 Egyptian warships held in reserve, suddenly hoisted sail and broke through the fighting, heading south, away from the battle. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's flagship depart, reportedly abandoned his own embattled flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and followed her, leaving the bulk of his fleet still engaged in a desperate struggle. The reasons for Cleopatra's departure and Antony's subsequent decision to follow have been fiercely debated for centuries. Hostile Roman sources claimed she fled out of fear, and he, besotted, abandoned his men. Plutarch suggests Cleopatra's squadron, seeing Antony's center in distress, signaled a retreat, and Antony, perhaps feeling the battle lost or prioritizing Cleopatra's safety, followed. A more strategic interpretation suggests a prearranged plan. If the battle turned decisively against them, Cleopatra's squadron, carrying the war treasury, would break out, with Antony joining her to preserve their leadership and continue the fight from a stronghold like Egypt. The presence of sails on their warships, unusual for close-quarters combat, lends some credence to this idea of a planned disengagement. Whatever the true motives, the sight of their leaders abandoning the battle had a devastating impact on the morale of Antony's remaining forces. Though many of his ships fought on bravely for several more hours, they were ultimately overwhelmed. By nightfall, Octavian and Agrippa had achieved a decisive victory. A significant portion of Antony's fleet was sunk or captured. A week later, Antony's land army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was more than just a naval defeat. It was the death knell of Antony and Cleopatra's ambitions. They had lost the bulk of their military power, their prestige was shattered, and their alliance was fatally weakened. Though they managed to escape to Egypt with a fraction of their fleet and the war treasury, they were now fugitives, their hopes of forging an Eastern empire in ruins. Octavian was the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Serpent and her Roman eagle had been decisively outmaneuvered and outfought. Their world, once glittering with the promise of shared dominion, was now rapidly shrinking, with the shadow of Octavian looming ever larger. The final act of their tragic drama was about to unfold on the banks of the Nile.
The crushing defeat at Actium in September of 31 BC was not merely a lost battle, it was the shattering of a world. For Antony and Cleopatra, the dream of an Eastern empire, of a shared dominion that could rival or even eclipse Rome, had dissolved amidst the smoke and carnage of that naval disaster. They had managed to escape with a fraction of their fleet and, crucially, Cleopatra's war treasury, making their way back to Alexandria. But they returned not as conquering heroes, but as wounded fugitives, their authority in tatters, their future bleak, and the shadow of Octavian looming ever larger, stretching inexorably towards the shores of Egypt. The year that followed, from the autumn of 31 BC to the summer of 30 BC, was a period of agonizing suspense, desperate maneuvering, and deepening despair in Alexandria. The once vibrant capital, the jewel of the Mediterranean, now pulsed with an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. What would Octavian do? When would his legions arrive? And what fate awaited their queen and her Roman consort?
Antony, according to Plutarch, was a broken man. The charismatic general, the boisterous, inimitable liver, seemed to collapse under the weight of his defeat and the perceived betrayal of his men. He retreated from public life, building a small dwelling by the sea near the Pharos lighthouse, which he called his Timonium, after Timon of Athens, the legendary misanthrope who had renounced all human society. Here Antony professed to imitate Timon's life because he had himself been wronged and treated with ingratitude by his friends, and therefore hated and distrusted all mankind. He shunned company, brooding over his misfortunes, his once indomitable spirit seemingly crushed. His loyal soldiers, who had fought bravely for him, had either surrendered or been annihilated at Actium. His political allies in the East, seeing the writing on the wall, were one by one defecting to Octavian, eager to secure their own positions with the new master of the Roman world. Cleopatra, however, reacted with a resilience born of a lifetime spent navigating treacherous political currents. While Antony wallowed in despair, she, at 38 years old, was a mother, with children whose futures were at stake, and a queen determined to salvage what she could from the wreckage. She could not afford the luxury of public despondency. Her primary concern was the preservation of her dynasty and the safety of her children, particularly Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, who represented both her greatest hope and, in Octavian's eyes, her greatest threat.
She embarked on a series of desperate and sometimes audacious schemes. According to Plutarch, she conceived a plan of almost breathtaking boldness: to drag her remaining ships overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, across the Isthmus of Suez, and sail away with her treasures and her children to some unknown land, perhaps India or Arabia, far beyond the reach of Rome. It was a fantastical notion, a testament to her desperation and her unwillingness to surrender. She even began the arduous process, but attacks by Nabatean Arabs, perhaps encouraged by one of Octavian's allies, forced her to abandon the attempt. Cleopatra also initiated frantic diplomatic efforts, sending envoys to Octavian, who was methodically consolidating his power in Greece and Asia Minor before making his final move on Egypt.
She reportedly offered to abdicate her throne in favor of her children if Octavian would spare them and allow her to live in private exile. She even, according to some hostile Roman sources, offered to betray Antony to save herself and her kingdom, a claim that fits neatly into Octavian's propaganda, but is difficult to verify and seems out of character for the queen who had staked so much on her alliance with Antony. Octavian's responses were coolly non-committal, designed to keep her hoping, perhaps to sow further discord between her and Antony, and to prevent her from taking any truly desperate measures, like destroying her vast treasury, which he coveted. He offered vague assurances of clemency for Cleopatra herself, but pointedly remained silent on the fate of Antony and, most ominously, Caesarion. As the months wore on and Octavian's forces drew ever closer, Antony eventually emerged from his self-imposed isolation. Perhaps Cleopatra's resilience shamed him, or perhaps the primal instinct for survival reasserted itself. He rejoined Cleopatra in the palace, and together they attempted to rally their remaining forces and prepare for the inevitable siege. They even tried to revive some semblance of their former revelry, though it must have had a hollow, desperate quality. Plutarch tells us they dissolved their famous Inimitable Livers Society and founded a new one, the Synapathanomenai, meaning companions in death or order of those who will die together. It was a grimly realistic acknowledgement of their likely fate, a pact to face the end with a show of defiance, or at least with each other.
They celebrated Antony's last birthday in the winter of 3130 BC with a desperate lavishness, as if trying to ward off the encroaching darkness with one final blaze of feasting and wine. They also focused on their children. Caesarion, now a young man of 17, was formally declared of age and enrolled as an ephibe, a citizen eligible for military service. This was a clear attempt to position him as a successor, a future king. Antony's son by his previous wife Fulvia, Marcus Antonius Antyllus, who was also in Alexandria, was similarly honored. These were gestures of defiance, but also perhaps of a dawning realization that their own time was running out. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, also began to make preparations for her own death. She had a magnificent mausoleum constructed near the Temple of Isis, a tomb designed to be her final resting place, but also, perhaps, a defensible stronghold where she could protect her treasures and make her last stand. She gathered her most valuable possessions, gold, silver, pearls, ivory, ebony, cinnamon, and other precious spices, within its walls. This was not just about protecting her wealth, it was also a potential bargaining chip or a final act of defiance. She let it be known that if Octavian pushed her too far, she would destroy herself and her treasures in a colossal funeral pyre, denying him the satisfaction of parading her and her wealth through the streets of Rome in his triumph. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian launched his final invasion of Egypt. He advanced from two directions. His general, Cornelius Gallus, moved from Cyrene in the west, while Octavian himself led the main force from Syria in the east. Pelusium, the eastern gateway to Egypt, which had once defied Caesar's legions, fell with suspicious ease, perhaps through treachery. Antony attempted to mount a defense. He achieved one last, fleeting military success, leading his cavalry in a spirited charge against Octavian's advance guard outside Alexandria, routing them. Flushed with this minor victory, he returned to the palace, embraced Cleopatra still in his armor, and presented the soldier who had fought most bravely to her for a reward. It was a brief echo of his former martial glory, a flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. But it was too little, too late. His remaining fleet, urged on by Cleopatra according to some accounts, defected to Octavian.
His infantry, seeing their naval support gone and perhaps influenced by promises of clemency from Octavian, also began to desert or surrender. The end was now unmistakably near. The love that had once seemed destined to forge an empire was now trapped in a dying city, surrounded by enemies, with only despair and the prospect of imminent death as their constant companions.
The mighty Mark Antony was dead, his lifeblood spilled within the cold stone walls of Cleopatra's nearly completed mausoleum. He had died in her arms, a tragic end for a man who had once commanded legions and held the fate of half the Roman world in his hands. For Cleopatra, his death was the final crushing blow. Her kingdom was lost, her armies defeated, her great love gone. All that remained was the looming presence of Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the pragmatic, implacable victor, and the terrifying prospect of her own humiliation. Octavian, for his part, was in a complex position. He undoubtedly wanted Cleopatra captured alive. She was, after all, the ultimate prize, the symbol of his hard-won victory over Antony and the East. Parading her through the streets of Rome in his triumph would be the crowning glory of his success, a spectacle to awe the Roman populace and solidify his own supreme authority. Furthermore, Cleopatra's vast treasury, hoarded within her mausoleum, was desperately needed to pay his legions and stabilize the Roman economy after years of civil war. So, while Antony lay dying, Octavian sent his own men, led by Gaius Proculeius, to secure the queen. Plutarch recounts that Proculeius, using a ladder, managed to gain entry to the upper level of the mausoleum, while another of Octavian's men, Epaphroditus, distracted Cleopatra at the door below as she negotiated terms through the bolted gates. She had barricaded herself inside with her two most loyal attendants, Iras and Charmian, and her immense treasure, threatening to set it all ablaze rather than surrender it or herself to Octavian. When Proculeius burst in, Cleopatra reportedly drew a dagger, intending to stab herself, but he swiftly disarmed her. She was now Octavian's prisoner. Though captured, Cleopatra did not immediately succumb to despair. She was, after all, a queen, a descendant of a long line of formidable rulers, and a woman of immense personal pride and political acumen. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, who, according to ancient accounts, visited her in person. Plutarch describes her in these final days as being in a state of deep mourning, her hair dishevelled, her voice trembling, her eyes red with weeping. She had inflicted wounds upon her own breast in her grief for Antony. Yet, even in this distressed state, she tried to appeal to Octavian's pity and, perhaps, his ambition. She presented him with letters from his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, reminders of their past connection. She may have hoped that her famed charm, which had captivated Caesar and Antony, might still work its magic on this younger, colder Roman. Octavian, however, was not Caesar, nor was he Antony. He was a master of dissimulation. He treated her with outward courtesy, assuring her that she would be honored and allowed to live, perhaps even hoping to lull her into a false sense of security. His primary objective remained unchanged, to get her to Rome for his triumph. He made no concrete promises about the future of her kingdom, or, crucially, the fate of her children, particularly Caesarion. Cleopatra, a shrewd judge of character, likely saw through his veneer of civility. She knew that for a Ptolemaic queen, to be paraded in a Roman triumph was the ultimate degradation, a public spectacle of utter defeat and subjugation. It was a fate worse than death. She famously declared, "I will not be led in a triumph." The exact details of her final days are shrouded in the mists of history and embellished by legend. It said she fell ill, perhaps genuinely from grief and self-inflicted wounds, or perhaps as a tactic to gain time or sympathy. She may have even refused food for a period. Octavian, concerned she might die before he could display her,
alternately threatened her children and offered her better care. Then, according to Plutarch, a crucial piece of information reached Cleopatra, possibly through a sympathetic Roman officer named Cornelius Dolabella. She learned that Octavian, his patience wearing thin or his plans solidifying, intended to ship her and her children off to Rome within 3 days. This was the ultimatum, the point of no return. Cleopatra resolved to die. She requested permission from Octavian to make libations at Antony's tomb, which was granted. After paying her final respects to her lost love, she returned to her mausoleum, bathed, and ordered a sumptuous final meal. It was during or after this meal that she wrote a final letter to Octavian, a sealed tablet, requesting that she be buried beside Antony. This letter, in effect, was her suicide note. When Octavian received the tablet and read its contents, he knew at once what she intended. He dispatched messengers in haste to the mausoleum. They burst in to find a scene of silent, regal death. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, adorned in her royal robes, dead. Her loyal attendant, Eros, lay dying at her feet. The other, Charmian, already faltering, was settling aright the diadem upon her mistress's head. When one of Octavian's men angrily asked, "Was this well done of your lady, Charmian?" she famously replied, "Excellently well, and worthily of the descendant of so many kings," before collapsing and dying herself.
But how did Cleopatra meet her end? This is one of history's most enduring mysteries. The traditional and most romanticized account, heavily promoted by Octavian's regime for its symbolic power, is that she died from the bite of an asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled to her in a basket of figs or perhaps a water jar. Plutarch himself says, "The truth of the matter no one knows," but he recounts the asp story as the most prevalent. He mentions that 2 faint pricks were found on her arm. The asp, or uraeus, was a potent symbol of Egyptian royalty and divine authority, associated with the sun god Ra and the goddess Isis, with whom Cleopatra identified. Death by the sacred serpent would have been a fittingly pharaonic and defiant end, a final embrace of her Egyptian identity and a denial of Roman conquest over her spirit. However, many historians, both ancient and modern, have questioned the practicality and reliability of death by snakebite, especially for 3 people, if Eros and Charmian died similarly. Cobras are notoriously unpredictable, their venom not always instantly fatal, and the idea of smuggling 1 or more past Roman guards seems fraught with difficulty. Strabo, a contemporary historian and geographer, mentioned that Cleopatra died either by the bite of an asp or by a poisonous ointment. Other accounts suggest a fast-acting poison hidden in a hollow comb or pin. A toxic concoction, perhaps of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium, could have provided a quicker, more certain, and less agonizing death. Whatever the precise method, Cleopatra's suicide on August 10th or 12th, 30 BC, at the age of 39, was a carefully calculated political act. It was her final assertion of agency, her ultimate refusal to be subjugated and humiliated by Octavian. It denied him his most prized captive for his triumph, and ensured that she, not he, would control the narrative of her end. Octavian, upon learning of her death, was reportedly angered by her defiance, yet also filled with a grudging admiration for her courage and queenly spirit. He ordered that she be buried with full royal honors beside Mark Antony, as she had wished. Her tomb, however, like that of Alexander the Great, has never been definitively located, adding another layer of mystery to her legend. The immediate aftermath of her death was swift and brutal. Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, was formally annexed as a Roman province. It was not just any province, however. Due to its immense wealth and strategic importance as Rome's granary, Octavian declared it his personal domain, to be governed by a prefect of equestrian rank directly responsible to him, not the Senate.
As for Cleopatra's children, their fates varied. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, the 17-year-old King of Kings, was betrayed by his tutor while attempting to flee south, possibly to Ethiopia or India. Octavian, coolly pragmatic and recognizing the potential threat Caesarion posed to his own legitimacy as Caesar's sole heir, ordered his execution. "It is not good to have too many Caesars," he is reported to have said, a chillingly concise death warrant. Cleopatra's 3 children by Mark Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selina II, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome, where, in 29 BC, they were paraded in golden chains in Octavian's magnificent triple triumph, walking behind an effigy of their dead mother, perhaps depicted with the asp. It was a poignant and humiliating spectacle, symbolizing Rome's final victory. After the triumph, the children were entrusted to the care of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister, a woman whose own husband had abandoned her for their mother. In a testament to her own remarkable character, Octavia reportedly raised them with kindness and generosity alongside her own children by Antony. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the historical record, likely dying young. But Cleopatra Selina II went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a Roman client kingdom in North Africa, where she ruled as a capable and cultured queen, ensuring that a fragment of Cleopatra's extraordinary lineage, if not her direct pharaonic power, endured. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, the magnificent, centuries-old Ptolemaic dynasty breathed its last. Egypt, the ancient kingdom of pharaohs, was absorbed into the inexorable machinery of the Roman Empire, becoming the personal fiefdom of Octavian, soon to be hailed as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Yet, while her political reign had ended, the story of Cleopatra was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning its journey into legend, a journey that would see her image twisted, romanticized, vilified, and endlessly reinterpreted through the ages. Her legacy is a complex tapestry woven from Roman propaganda, poetic imagination, scholarly debate, and an enduring public fascination. The first, and arguably most influential, shapers of Cleopatra's posthumous image were her Roman conquerors, particularly Octavian. Having defeated her in war, he now sought to control her narrative in peace. As the historian Cassius Dio, writing nearly 2.5 centuries later but drawing on earlier Roman sources, noted, Octavian both hated and admired her. But political expediency demanded a clear villain. Thus, Roman poets and historians, often writing under the patronage of Augustus and his successors, solidified the image of Cleopatra as the foreign temptress, the Egyptian woman whose insatiable ambition and exotic allure had corrupted noble Romans like Antony and threatened the very fabric of Roman society. Horace, in his famous Cleopatra Ode, Odes 137, memorably called her a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster or prodigy. But even he, in the end, acknowledged her courageous, queenly demise. A woman no Boadicea to be borne off, unqueenly, in some Liburnian galley, she dared to gaze with steady eye upon her fallen palace. She had the courage to handle angry asps and drink their black poison to her heart. Virgil, in his epic Aeneid, subtly aligns her with the forces of chaos and the decadent East, arrayed against the disciplined, divinely ordained might of Rome. This Roman portrayal, a potent cocktail of fear, fascination, and political expediency, cast a long shadow. It emphasized her sexuality as her primary weapon, her ambition as inherently destructive, and her foreignness as a mark of otherness and danger. Her intellect, her political acumen, her skills as a ruler, and her genuine efforts to restore Egypt's former glory were largely downplayed or ignored.
She became, in effect, a cautionary tale for Roman matrons and a symbol of the dangers that lay beyond Rome's well-ordered frontiers.
Centuries later, the European Renaissance rediscovered the classical world, and with it, the dramatic story of Cleopatra. She became a favorite subject for artists and writers who often drew heavily on the Roman accounts, particularly Plutarch's Life of Antony. Plutarch, while providing invaluable historical detail, also possessed a keen eye for drama and character, and his portrayal of the passionate, intelligent, and ultimately tragic queen provided fertile ground for artistic interpretation. No one, perhaps, did more to shape the enduring popular image of Cleopatra than William Shakespeare. His tragedy, Antony and Cleopatra, first performed around 1607, presents a queen of infinite variety, a woman of captivating charm, fierce intelligence, theatrical temperament, and profound passion. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is not merely a seductress. She is a complex, flawed, and deeply human ruler, whose love for Antony is both her glory and her undoing. As Enobarbus, Antony's loyal soldier, famously says of her, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale, her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where most she satisfies." Shakespeare immortalized her as a figure of immense romantic and tragic stature, a portrayal that has echoed through countless adaptations and reinterpretations. Later writers, like George Bernard Shaw in his play Caesar and Cleopatra, 1898, offered different perspectives. Shaw's Cleopatra is a young, somewhat naive girl at the beginning, learning the art of queenship from a world-weary, fatherly Caesar, a portrayal that emphasized her intelligence and development rather than her seductive powers. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen an explosion of Cleopatra portrayals in film, television, and popular literature. From the silent film vamp Theda Bara to Claudette Colbert's witty queen, Vivien Leigh's tragic heroine, and Elizabeth Taylor's famously opulent and controversial portrayal opposite Richard Burton's Antony, Hollywood has been particularly enamored with Cleopatra's story, often emphasizing the romance and spectacle, sometimes at the expense of historical accuracy. These popular depictions, for better or worse, have cemented her image in the public consciousness as a glamorous, seductive, and ultimately tragic figure. This ongoing fascination and reinterpretation took a particularly sharp turn in 2023 with the release of the Netflix docuseries African Queens, Queen Cleopatra, produced by Jada Pinkett Smith. The series cast Adele James, a biracial British actress, in the titular role, a decision that ignited a firestorm of controversy, particularly in Egypt. Egyptian authorities, including the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities and prominent Egyptologists like Zahi Hawass, vehemently condemned the portrayal. They issued statements insisting that the historical Cleopatra, as a member of the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, had light skin and Hellenistic Greek features, and that depicting her as black was a falsification of Egyptian history and a blatant historical misconception. The fact that the production was labeled a docudrama or documentary became a central point of contention, with critics arguing that this genre demanded adherence to historical and scientific facts. Legal complaints were filed in Egypt accusing Netflix of attempting to erase the Egyptian identity and promoting an Afrocentric agenda, with calls to ban the platform in the country. The producers and some involved with the series defended the casting, with Jada Pinkett Smith stating, "We don't often get to see or hear stories about black queens, and that was really important for me." Actress Adele James noted that Cleopatra's heritage is highly debated, and that as an actress, she aimed to humanize the queen.
Netflix, on its companion website Tudum, described the casting as a nod to the centuries-long conversation about the ruler's race, acknowledging that while Cleopatra's paternal lineage was Greek, the identity of her mother and paternal grandmother remains unknown, allowing for speculation about African ancestry. This recent firestorm vividly illustrates that Cleopatra's image is far from settled. It remains a potent cultural symbol, fiercely contested and subject to passionate debates about history, identity, representation, and who has the right to tell her story. Beyond the layers of propaganda, romance, myth, and modern controversies, what of Cleopatra the ruler? Modern historians, armed with a more critical eye towards ancient sources and new archaeological and numismatic evidence, have sought to provide a more balanced and nuanced assessment of her reign. While acknowledging her ambition and her often ruthless methods par for the course in the Hellenistic world, they also highlight her considerable skills and achievements.
As Duane W. Roller, a prominent modern biographer of Cleopatra, has emphasized, she was an extremely capable Hellenistic monarch. She ruled Egypt for over 2 decades, a significant achievement in a period of intense political instability and Roman encroachment. She was a hands-on administrator, deeply involved in the governance of her kingdom. Inscriptions and papyri reveal her attention to economic matters, her efforts to combat corruption, and her responses to crises like famine and plague. An edict from her reign concerning injustices in the transport of grain shows her direct intervention. Let no one who transports the grain destined for Alexandria disobey this edict. I shall consider anyone who disobeys it to be among the greatest offenders. This demonstrates her authority and concern for the vital grain supply. Her monetary reforms, including the debasement of coinage to boost exports and the introduction of a closed currency system, were sophisticated attempts to manage Egypt's complex economy and its relationship with the Roman financial world. As historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes, Cleopatra's financial acumen and Egypt's resources were vital to Antony. Her building programs, such as the Caesareum in Alexandria and her contributions to temples like Dendera, not only beautified her capital but also served to legitimize her rule and that of her son, Caesarion, linking them to both Roman power and ancient Egyptian religious traditions. Her famed linguistic abilities, her command of perhaps 9 languages, including Egyptian, a first for the Ptolemaic dynasty, were not merely an intellectual curiosity, but a vital tool of diplomacy and governance, allowing her to communicate directly with diverse peoples within her realm and beyond. Plutarch remarked on this, noting that it was a pleasure merely to hear the sound of her voice, with which, like an instrument of many strings, she could pass from one language to another. Her foreign policy, though ultimately unsuccessful in preserving Egypt's long-term independence, was a daring and often brilliant attempt to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman power politics. She sought to use alliances with powerful Roman figures like Caesar and Antony, not just for her personal survival, but to restore Egypt to a position of preeminence in the eastern Mediterranean, to reclaim territories lost by her predecessors, and to forge a new kind of Hellenistic empire that could coexist, perhaps even as an equal partner, with Rome. Stacy Schiff, another biographer, argues that Cleopatra proved a remarkably capable ruler. For 2 decades, she kept her country prosperous and at peace. Yet the romanticized and vilified images often overshadow these achievements. She remains a potent cultural symbol, embodying different things to different people. The ultimate femme fatale, a tragic lover, a symbol of female power and ambition in a man's world, an icon of exotic allure, or a nationalist hero who defied Roman imperialism. Her story raises enduring questions about power, gender, cultural identity, and the complex interplay between personal desire and political destiny.
In recent years, there has been a growing movement to reclaim Cleopatra from the clutches of Roman propaganda and Hollywood exoticism, to see her not just as the lover of powerful men, but as a formidable political figure in her own right, intelligent, educated, multilingual, and a capable ruler who fought fiercely, if ultimately unsuccessfully, to preserve her kingdom's independence in the face of overwhelming Roman power. Her tragedy was perhaps inevitable, caught as she was between the fading light of the Hellenistic world and the dawning might of the Roman Empire. But her decision to die by her own hand, rather than be paraded in Octavian's triumph, was her final act of defiance, a queen to the very end, ensuring that she, not her conquerors, would write the last line of her own story. As Plutarch reflected, even Octavian, though angered, admired the loftiness of her spirit. Cleopatra's legacy, therefore, is not a simple one. It is a rich, contested, and endlessly fascinating narrative that continues to captivate our imagination. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a descendant of Greek conquerors who embraced the ancient traditions of her land, a scholar, a diplomat, a naval commander, a mother, and a queen who dared to challenge the might of Rome. Her echoes resonate through 2 millennia, a testament to an extraordinary life lived on an epic scale, a story of power, allure, and tragedy that time cannot wither nor custom stale.
And so the curtain falls on the extraordinary life of Cleopatra VII. Her story, one of ambition, intellect, and passion, transcends the ancient world, challenging us even now. She was a queen who navigated the treacherous currents of empire, using her considerable skills not merely for romance, as legend often portrays, but in calculated political partnerships to safeguard her throne and Egypt's influence. Her efforts to fuse her Greek heritage with Egyptian traditions, her linguistic mastery, and her capable administration reveal a ruler far more complex than the seductive caricature. The end of her reign marked the fall of a kingdom and an era, yet her final act of defiance, choosing death over humiliation in Octavian's triumph, cemented her as an indomitable spirit. Cleopatra's legacy remains a vibrant, contested space, a mirror reflecting our evolving understanding of power, gender, and empire. She compels us to look beyond myth, to appreciate the multifaceted woman who dared to be queen in a world dominated by kings, ensuring her story continues to echo through eternity. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and times of Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile. Her story, filled with triumph and tragedy, love and loss, ambition and defiance, continues to teach us about the complexities of power, the enduring allure of leadership, and the indelible mark one individual can leave on the vast canvas of history. The serpent's coil may have unwound, but the legend of Cleopatra endures, an echo through eternity. If you made it all the way here, whether you're still wide awake or already halfway to dreamland, thank you for spending some time with Legendary Lives. If you enjoyed the story, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more, and share a thought in the comments. I'd love to hear what kind of lives you'd like to hear about next. Until next time, rest well.